Recorded Books and One Click Digital present Who Buries the Dead? A Sebastian Sincere Mystery by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter. Luke, chapter 9, verse 60. Let the dead bury their dead. Chapter 1. Sunday, 21st of March, 1813. They called it Bloody Bridge. It lay at the end of a dark, winding lane far beyond the comforting flicker of the oil lamps of Sloane Square, beyond the last of the tumble-down cottages at the edge of a vast stretch of fields that showed only black in the moonless night. Narrow and hemmed in on both sides by high walls, the bridge was built of brick, worn and crumbling with age and slippery with moss, where the elms edging the rivulet cast a deep, cold shade. Cian O'Neill tried to avoid this place even in daylight. It had been Molly's idea to come here, for on the far side of the bridge lay a deserted barn with a warm, soft hayloft that beckoned to young lovers in need. But now, as the wind tossed the elms along the creek and brought the distant, mournful howl of a dog, Cian felt the hard, pulsing urgency that had driven him here begin to ebb. "Maybe this ain't such a good idea, Molly," he said, his step lagging. "The barn, I mean." She swung to face him, dark eyes shiny in a plump, merry face. "What's the matter, Cian?" She pressed her warm, yielding body against his, her voice husky. "You having second thoughts?" "No, it's just—" The wind gusted up stronger, banging a shutter somewhere in the night, and he jerked. To his shame, he saw enlightenment dawn on her face, and she gave a trill of laughter. "You're scared?" "No, I ain't," he said, even though they both knew it for a lie. He was a big lad, 18 next month, and strong and hale, but at the moment he felt like a wee tyke, frightened by old Irish tales of the Doulahan. She caught his hand in both of hers and backed down the lane ahead of him, pulling him toward the bridge. "Come on, then," she said. "How about if I cross first?" It had rained earlier in the evening, a brief but heavy downpour that left the newly budding leaves of the trees dripping moisture and the lane slippery with mud. He felt an icy tickle at the base of his neck and tried to think about the sweet warmth of the hayloft and the way Molly's soft, eager body would feel beneath his. They were close enough to the bridge now that Cian could see it quite clearly, its single arch a deeper black against the roiling darkness of the sky. But something wasn't quite right, and he felt his scalp prickle, his breath catch, as the silhouette of a man's head loomed before them. "What is it?" Molly asked, the laughter draining from her face as she whirled around, and Cian started to scream. Chapter 2. Monday, 22nd of March, the hours before dawn. The child lay curled on his side in a cradle near the hearth, his tiny pink lips parted with the slow, even breath of sleep. He had one tightly clenched fist tucked up beneath his chin, and in the firelight the translucent flesh of his closed eyelids looked so delicate and fragile that it terrified his father, who stood watching him. Some day this infant would be Viscount Devlin, and then, in time, the Earl of Hendon. But now he was simply the Honourable Simon Sincere, barely 7 weeks old, and oblivious to the fact that he had no more real right to any of those titles than his father, Sebastian Sincere, the current Viscount Devlin. Devlin rested the heel of one outthrust palm against the mantelpiece. His breath came harsh and ragged, and sweat sheened his naked flesh despite the air's chill. He'd been driven from his sleep by memories he generally chose not to revisit during daylight, but he could not stop the images that came to him in the quiet hours of darkness, visions of dancing flames, of a woman's tortured body writhing in helpless agony, of soft brown hair fluttering against the waxen flesh of a dead child's cheek. "The past never leaves us," he thought. "We carry it with us through our lives, a ghostly burden of bittersweet nostalgia threaded with guilt and regret that wearies the soul and whispers to us in the darkest hours of the night. Only the youngest children are truly innocent, for their consciences are still untroubled, their haunted days yet to come. He shuddered, and bent to throw more coal on the fire, moving carefully so as not to wake the sleeping babe or his mother. When Sebastian was a child, it had been the custom for the infants of the aristocracy and the gentry to be farmed out to wet nurses, often not returning to their own families until they were 2 years of age. But it was becoming more common now for even duchesses to choose to nurse their own offspring, and Hero, the child's mother and Sebastian's wife of 8 months, had been adamantly against hiring a wet nurse. His gaze shifted to the blue silk-hung bed where she slept, her rich dark hair spilling across the pillow. And he felt it again, that nameless wash of apprehension for this woman and this child, that he dismissed as lingering wisps from his dream and fear born of a guilt that could never be assuaged. A clatter of hooves and the rattle of carriage wheels over granite paving stones carried clearly in the stillness of the night. Sebastian raised his head, his body tensing as the carriage jerked to a halt, and a man's quick, heavy tread ran up his front steps. He heard the distant peal of his bell, then a gruff, questioning shout from his major-domo, Maury. "Message for Lord Devlin," answered the unknown visitor, his voice strained by a sense of urgency and what sounded very much like horror. "From Sir Henry, of Bow Street." Sebastian threw on his dressing gown and slipped quietly from the room. Chapter 3. The head had been positioned near the end of one of the low brick walls lining the old bridge, its sightless face turned as if to watch anyone unwary enough to approach. A man's head, it had thick, greying dark hair, heavy eyebrows, and a long, prominent nose. "Nasty business, this," said the burly constable, the pine torch in his hand hissing and spitting as he held it aloft in the blustery wind. Sir Henry Lovejoy, the newest of Bow Street's 3 stipendiary magistrates, watched the golden light dance over the pale features of that frozen, staring face, and felt his stomach give an uncomfortable lurch. The night was unusually cold and starless, the flaring torches of the constables fanning out along the banks of the small stream, filling the air with the scent of burning pitch. They'd need to make a more thorough search of the area in the morning, of course, but this was a start. Even in daylight, this rutted, muddy lane was seldom travelled, for beyond the winding rivulet spanned by the narrow single-arched bridge lay a vast open area of market and nursery gardens, known as the 5 Fields. All was shrouded now in an eerie blackness, so complete as to seem impenetrable. Hunching his shoulders against the cold, Lovejoy moved to where the rest of the unfortunate gentleman's strong, solid body lay sprawled in the lane's grassy verge, his once neatly arranged linen cravat disordered and stained dark, the raw, hacked flesh of his neck too gruesome to bear close inspection. He'd been Lovejoy's age, in his 50s. That should not have bothered Lovejoy, but for some reason he didn't care to dwell on, it did. He drew a quick breath, fouled with a heavy, coppery stench, and groped for his handkerchief. "You're certain this was Mr. Stanley Preston?" "I'm afraid so, sir," said the constable. A stout young man with bulging eyes, he towered over Lovejoy, who was both short and slight. Molly, the barmaid from the Rose and Crown, recognised the, head, sir, and I found his calling cards in his pocket. Lovejoy pressed the folded handkerchief to his lips. Under any circumstances, such a gruesome murder would be cause for concern. But when the victim was cousin to Lord Sidmouth, a former Prime Minister who now served as Home Secretary, the ramifications had the potential to be serious indeed. The local magistrate had immediately called in Bow Street and then withdrawn from the investigation entirely. The sound of an approaching carriage, driven fast, jerked Lovejoy's attention from the blood-drenched corpse at their feet. He watched as a sleek curricle, drawn by a pair of fine chestnuts, swung off Sloane Street to run along the north side of the square and enter the shadowy lane leading to the bridge. The driver was a gentleman, tall and lean, wearing a caped coat and elegant beaver hat. At the sight of Lovejoy, he drew up, and the half-grown groom, or tiger, who clung to a perch at the rear of the carriage, leapt down to run to the horses' heads. "Best walk them, Tom," said Devlin, jumping lightly from the curricle's high seat. "That's a nasty wind." "Aye, governor," said the boy. "My lord," said Lovejoy, moving thankfully to meet him. "My apologies for calling you out in the middle of such a wretched night, but I fear this case is worrisome. Most worrisome." "Sir Henry," said Devlin. Then his gaze shifted beyond Lovejoy to the severed head perched at the end of the bridge, and he let out a harsh breath. "Good God!" The Viscount was some 25 years younger than Lovejoy, and stood at least a foot taller, with hair nearly as dark as a gypsy's, and strange amber eyes that gleamed a feral yellow in the torchlight as the two men turned to walk toward the stream. "Have you learned anything yet?" he asked. "Nothing, really, beyond the victim's identity." They had first met when Devlin was wanted for murder, and Lovejoy had been determined to bring him in to trial. In the 2 years since that time, what had begun as respect had deepened into an unlikely friendship. In Devlin, Lovejoy had found an unexpected ally with a fierce passion for justice, a brilliant mind, and a rare genius for solving murders. But the young Viscount also possessed something no Bow Street magistrate or constable could ever hope to acquire, an innate understanding and knowledge of the rarefied world of gentlemen's clubs and society balls, frequented by the likes of the man whose head now decorated this deserted bridge on the edge of Hanstown and Chelsea. "Were you acquainted with Mr. Preston, my lord?" Lovejoy asked, as Devlin paused to study the dead man's bloodless features. The wind shifted the greying hair in a way that, for one horrible moment, made the man seem almost alive. "Only slightly." Preston's fine beaver hat lay upside down at the base of the pier, and Devlin bent to pick it up, his face thoughtful as he felt the crown and brim. Lovejoy said, "I fear Bow Street is going to come under tremendous pressure from both the Palace and Westminster to solve this. Quickly." Devlin's gaze shifted to meet his. They both understood the ways in which that kind of pressure could lead to the hasty arrest and conviction of an innocent man. "You're asking for my help?" "I am, yes, my lord." Lovejoy waited anxiously for a response, but the Viscount simply stared off across the darkened fields, his face giving nothing away. Lovejoy knew Devlin's own near-fatal encounter with the clumsy workings of the British legal system had much to do with his dedication to seeking justice for the victims of murder. But the magistrate had always suspected there was more to it than that. Something had happened to the Viscount, some dark but unknown incident in the past that had driven him to resign his commission in the army and embark on a path of self-destruction from which he had only recently begun to recover. The wind gusted up stronger, thrashing the limbs of the elms along the creek, and sending a torn playbill scuttling across the bridge's worn brick paving. Devlin said, "The crown and upper brim of Preston's hat are wet, but not the underside. And since the hair on his head looks dry, too, I'd say he was out walking in the rain, but was killed after it let up." "What time was that?" "About 10:30, said Lovejoy, and let go a sigh of relief. Chapter 4. Sebastian turned to where Preston's body lay on its back, arms flung out to the sides, one leg slightly bent, the wet grass dark with his blood. He'd seen many such sights, and worse, in the 6 years he'd spent in the army, but he'd never become inured to carnage. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then hunkered down beside the headless corpse. "Who found him?" he asked, resting a forearm on one knee. "A barmaid and stable boy from the Rose and Crown," said Lovejoy, "just after 11. It was the barmaid, Molly Watson, I believe she's called, who alerted the local magistrate." Sebastian twisted around to study the deserted lane.
What was she doing here at that time of night? I haven't actually spoken to her. Sir Thomas, the local magistrate, told her she could go home before I arrived. But from what I understand, she couldn't seem to come up with a coherent explanation.
Lovejoy's voice tightened with disapproval.
Sir Thomas says he suspects their destination was the hayloft of that barn over there.
Sebastian had to duck his head to hide a smile. A staunch reformist, Lovejoy lived by a strict personal moral code, and was therefore frequently shocked by the activities of those whose approach to life was considerably freer than his own.
Was his greatcoat open like this when he was found?
Asked Sebastian. He could see Preston's pocket-watch lying on the ground beside his hip, still fastened to its gold chain.
One of the constables said something about searching the man's pockets for his cards. I suspect he must have opened the greatcoat in the process.
Sebastian jerked off one glove and reached out to touch the blood-soaked waistcoat. His hand came away, wet and sticky.
"He's still faintly warm,"
he said, wiping his hand on his handkerchief.
"Do you know when he was last seen?" "According to his staff, he went out around 9. His house isn't far from here, just off Hans Place. I'm told he was a widower with 2 grown children, a son in Jamaica and an unmarried daughter. Unfortunately, the daughter spent the evening with friends and has no knowledge of her father's plans for the night."
Sebastian let his gaze drift over the darkened, grassy banks of the nearby stream.
"I wonder what the devil he was doing here. Somehow I find it doubtful he was looking for a warm hayloft." "I shouldn't think so, no,"
said Sir Henry, clearing his throat uncomfortably. Sebastian pushed to his feet.
"You'll be sending the body to Gibson?" he asked.
A one-legged Irish surgeon with a dangerous opium addiction, Paul Gibson could read the secrets of a dead body better than anyone else in England. Sir Henry nodded.
"I doubt he'll be able to tell us anything beyond the obvious, but I suppose we ought to have him take a look."
Sebastian brought his gaze again to the head on the bridge, the puddle of blood beneath it, congealed in the cold.
"Why cut off his head?"
he said, half to himself.
"Why display it on the bridge?"
It had been the practice, once, to mount the heads of traitors on spikes set atop London Bridge, but that barbarity had been abandoned nearly 150 years ago.
"As a warning, perhaps?"
suggested Sir Henry.
"To whom?"
The magistrate shook his head.
"I can't imagine."
"It takes a powerful hatred, or rage, to drive most people to mutilate the body of another human being."
"Rage or madness,"
said Sir Henry.
"True."
Sebastian went to study the ground near the bridge's old brick footings. He carried no torch, but then he didn't need one, for there was an animal-like acuity to his eyesight and hearing that enabled him to see great distances and in the dark, and to distinguish sounds he'd come to realize were inaudible to most of his fellow men.
"What is it?"
asked Sir Henry, as Sebastian slid down to the water's edge and bent to pick up an object, perhaps 1.5 feet in length, and 3 or 4 inches wide, but very thin.
"It appears to be an old metal strap of some sort,"
said Sebastian, turning it over in his hands.
"Probably lead. It's been freshly cut at both ends, and there's an inscription. It says—"
He broke off.
"What? What does it say?"
He looked up.
"It says, King Charles, 1648. "Merciful heavens,"
whispered Sir Henry. Every English schoolboy knew the story of King Charles I, grandson of Mary, Queen of Scots. Put on trial by Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan cohorts, he was beheaded on the 30th of January, 1649. Only, because the old-style calendar reckoned the new year as beginning on the 25th of March, rather than the 1st of January, chroniclers of the time recorded the execution date as 1648.
Perhaps it's unrelated to the murder, said Sir Henry. Who knows how long it's been here? The top surface is dry, so it must have been dropped since the rain let up. But what could a man like Stanley Preston possibly have to do with Charles I? Aside from sharing the manner of his death, you mean, said Sebastian. The magistrate tightened his lips in a way that whitened the flesh beside his suddenly pinched nostrils. There is that. A church bell began to toll somewhere in the distance, then another. The mist was beginning to creep up from the river, cold and clammy. Sebastian watched as Sir Henry stared off down the lane to where the oil lamps of Sloane Square now showed only as a murky glow. It's frightening to think that the man who did this is out there right now, said the magistrate, living amongst us. And he could do it again. Neither Sir Henry nor Sebastian said it, but the words were there, carried on the cold, wild wind. Chapter 5. The smell of freshly spilled blood had spooked the horses, so that Sebastian had his hands full as he turned the curricle toward home. "Is that really an head on the bridge?" Tom asked as they swung into Sloane Street. "A man's head?" "It is." The tiger let out his breath in a rush of ghoulish excitement. Caw! Small and sharp-faced, the boy had been with Sebastian for more than 2 years now. Not even Tom knew his exact age or his last name. He'd been living alone on the streets when he tried to pick Sebastian's pocket, and ended up saving Sebastian's life. More than once. Sebastian said, "It belongs, or I suppose I should say belonged, to a Mr. Stanley Preston." Tom must have caught the inflection in Sebastian's voice, because he said, "I'll take it you didn't much care for the cove?" "I barely knew him, actually. Although I must admit I have difficulties with men whose wealth comes from sugar plantations in the West Indies." "Because they grow sugar?" "Because their plantations are worked not by tenants, but by slaves, mostly Africans, although they also use transported Irish and Scottish rebels." They bowled along in silence until they'd passed the Hyde Park Turnpike, and were weaving their way through the quiet, rain-drenched streets of Mayfair. Then Tom said suddenly, "If you didn't like him, then why you care that somebody offed him?" "Because even those who own West Indies plantations don't deserve to be brutally murdered. Apart from which, I find the idea of sharing my city with someone who goes around cutting off the heads of his enemies somewhat disconcerting." What? Disconcerting. It makes me feel uncomfortable. "I reckon it was a Frenchman," said Tom, who had a profound suspicion of foreigners in general, and the French in particular. "They're always cutting off folks' heads." "An interesting theory that certainly merits consideration." Sebastian drew up before the front steps of his Brook Street townhouse. The oil lamps mounted on either side of the door cast a soft pool of golden light across the wet paving, but the house itself was dark and quiet, its inhabitants still sleeping. "Take care of the horses, then go to bed and stay there. It's nearly dawn." Tom scrambled forward to take the reins as Sebastian dropped lightly to the pavement. "You gonna have a lie-in?" "No." "Then I don't reckon I will," said Tom, his chin jutting forward mulishly. Sebastian grunted. The lad's grasp of the concept of obedience was still rather shaky. He watched Tom drive off toward the mews, then turned to enter the house. Moving quietly, he stripped off his clothes in the dressing-room and slipped into bed beside Hero. He didn't want to wake her, but the need to feel her warm, vital body against his was too strong. He carefully slid one arm around her waist and pressed his chest against the long line of her back. Her hand came up to rest on his, and in the darkness he saw her lips curve into a soft smile as she shifted so she could look at him over her shoulder. "You were a long time," she said. Was it as bad as Sir Henry's message led you to expect?
Worse.
He buried his face in the dark, fragrant fall of her hair.
Go back to sleep.
Can you sleep?
In a while.
I can help, she said huskily, her hand sliding low over his naked hip, his breath catching in his throat as she turned in his arms and covered his mouth with hers. He came downstairs the next morning to find Hero in the entryway, wearing a hunter green pelisse and velvet hat with 3 plumes. She was pulling on a pair of soft kid gloves, but paused when she looked up and saw him. "Well, good morning," she said, her eyes gently smiling at him. "I didn't expect to see you up this early."
"It's not early."
She shifted to adjust her hat in the looking-glass over the console. "It is when you've been up most of the night." She was an extraordinarily tall woman, nearly as tall as Sebastian, with hair of rich medium brown and fine grey eyes that sparkled with an intelligence of almost frightening intensity. She had the kind of looks more often described as handsome than pretty, with a strong chin, a wide mouth, and an aquiline nose she had inherited from her father, Lord Jarvis, a distant cousin of the mad old King George, and the real power behind the Prince of Wales's fragile regency. Once Jarvis had tried to have Sebastian killed, and undoubtedly still would if he found it expedient.
"Another interview?"
he asked, watching her tilt her hat just so.
"What is it this time?
Dustmen, chimney sweeps,
flower girls,
costermongers."
Ah.
She was writing a series of articles on London's working poor that she intended to eventually gather together into a book. It was a project that disgusted her father, both because he considered such activities unsuitable for a female, and because the entire undertaking smacked of the kind of radicalism he abhorred. But then, Hero had never allowed her father's expectations or prejudices to constrain her. She said, "Stanley Preston's murder is in all the morning papers. Was he truly decapitated?"
"He was."
She pivoted slowly to face him again, her eyes wide and still. He said,
"Do you have a moment? There's something I'd like you to see."
"Of course." Slipping off her pelisse, she followed him into the library where he'd left the ancient metal strap on his desk.
"I found this not far from Preston's body."
He handed her the length of lead and gave her a brief description of the scene at the bridge. "King Charles, 1648, she read, then looked up at him. "I don't understand. What is it?"
"I could be wrong, but I've seen strips of metal like this before, wrapped around old coffins."
"Surely you're not suggesting this came from the coffin of Charles I?"
"I don't know.
But it's telling. The inscription reads King Charles, rather than Charles I, and 1648 rather than 1649. Where exactly is Charles I buried?
I've realized I have no idea."
"No one does. After the execution, there was talk of interring him in Westminster Abbey, but Cromwell refused to allow it, so the king's men took the body away at night and buried it in secret. There are conflicting reports about what they did with him. I've heard speculation he may be somewhere in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, but no one knows for certain." She frowned. What were Preston's politics?
"I'd be surprised if he nourished any secret nostalgia for the Stuarts, if that's what you're thinking."
She ran her fingertips over the scrolled engraving, her features composed but thoughtful. "Do you mind if I show it to Jarvis?" she asked, reaching for her pelisse again.
"He's not going to like my involving you in another murder investigation."
"Don't worry," she said, as Sebastian took the pelisse from her hands to help her on with it. "I seriously doubt he could dislike you more than he already does." He laughed at that. Then he turned her in his arms, his hands lingering on her shoulders, his laughter stilling. "What?" she asked, watching him.
"Just that,
Whoever killed Stanley Preston was either driven by a rage bordering on madness, or he is mad. And of the two, I'm not certain which makes him more dangerous.
Madness is always frightening, I suppose, because it's so incomprehensible. Yet I think I'd fear more the man who is brutal but sane, and therefore capable of shrewd, cold calculation.
Because he's clever?
That, and because he's less likely to make mistakes. Chapter 6. Sebastian ordered his curricle brought round and came out of the house half an hour later to find Tom walking the greys up and down Brook Street. It had rained again sometime in the early morning hours, leaving the pavement wet, with dull, heavy clouds that pressed down on the city's crowded rooftops and soaring chimneys. The horse's breath showed white in the cold.
"If you fall asleep and tumble off your perch," said Sebastian, taking the reins, "I won't stop and pick you up."
But Tom simply laughed and scrambled back to his place. They headed south, curling around the edge of Hyde Park, where faint wisps of mist still drifted through the trees, and the distant clumps of shrubs were no more than blurred shadows. There had been a time not so long ago when Knightsbridge and Handstown were sleepy, pleasant villages lying several miles beyond the sprawl of London. Now, neat terrace houses of 3 and 5 stories, plus basements and attics, lined spacious squares and a broad thoroughfare called Sloane Street that stretched from Knightsbridge down toward Chelsea in the Thames. This was a district favoured by prosperous barristers, physicians, and bankers, with a scattering of respectable lodging houses and workshops, and a few more modest but comfortable homes for tradesmen. Reluctant to disturb Preston's grieving daughter so early in the day, Sebastian went instead to the Rose and Crown. A well-tended inn built of brick in the last years of the 18th century, it had a freshly whitewashed arch leading to a bustling yard and a public room that smelled of bacon and wood smoke and hearty ale. A buxom, dark-haired, dark-eyed girl of perhaps 16 was wiping the tables when Sebastian walked in.
"You're Molly?" he asked.
She turned, a smile lighting up her pretty face as she let her gaze rove over him in frank assessment. "I am. Who are you?"
"Devlin. I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about last night."
The smile disappeared, and she retreated behind the gleaming oak counter that stretched along one wall. "What you want to know for? You don't look like no beak to me."
"I'm not."
He laid a coin on the counter between them, the metal clicking softly against the polished wood.
"I'm told you recognized Mr. Preston last night. Did he come here often?"
Her hand flashed out and the coin disappeared. "Sometimes, though he mostly favoured the monster."
"The monster?"
She jerked her head toward the west. "It's just off Sloane Street." She wrinkled her little button of a nose. "The place is so old you have to walk down a couple of steps to get in the front door." Sebastian let his gaze wander around the tap room with its neat round tables and straight-backed chairs and gleaming wainscoting.
"Did Mr. Preston come in here last night?"
"Nah, ain't seen him for a fortnight or more."
"When he would come in, what did he drink?"
"Ale, mostly. But he weren't no lush, if that's what you're asking. Usually he'd just pop in for a quick pint of an evening, then leave." Sebastian brought his gaze back to her pretty, expressive face.
"I understand you're the one who told the magistrate what you'd found at the bridge. But someone else was with you, wasn't he? Someone from the stables?"
"Cian O'Neill." Her voice dripped scorn. "Took one look at that head sitting up there and started screaming like he weren't never going to stop. When I said we got to go tell Sir Thomas, he took to shaking all over, and his eyes got so big I thought they was going to pop right out of his head. I grabbed hold of his arm, but he jerked away and run off, never even looked back."
"Did you see anyone else near the bridge?"
She stared at him. "What are you thinking? That there was 2 heads there?"
"I was wondering if you might have seen someone running away as you walked up the lane." No, I remember laughing at Cian because it was so dark and quiet. He was scared even before we seen the head.
Can you think of any reason for Mr. Preston to have been at the bridge at that time of night?
Her eyes widened slightly. Never thought about that, but, well, no. Truth is, most folks around here tend to avoid Bloody Bridge after dark.
Bloody Bridge?
That's what it's called, you know.
No, I didn't know.
She sniffed, nearly as contemptuous of his ignorance as she was of poor Cian O'Neill's terror. Folks say it's haunted by those who've died there over the years.
Yet you weren't afraid to go there, said Sebastian.
She shrugged. It's the quickest way to get to Five Fields, ain't it?
And why would you want to go to Five Fields at night?
She gave him an impish smile and raised her eyebrows in a knowing look. I won't be going there with Cian again, that's for sure.
Tell me, what did you think of Mr. Preston?
She shrugged. He never give me no trouble, the way some of them do, if that's what you're asking.
Have you heard anyone speculating about what they think might have happened to him?
Most folks are saying footpads must have done it, which just goes to show what they know.
What makes you so certain it wasn't footpads?
She lifted her chin. Why, I could see his pocket watch, couldn't I? Dangling from its chain like he was just checking the time. Ain't no footpad going to go to all the trouble of cutting off a fella's head and then leave his watch like that.
Mr. Preston's greatcoat was unbuttoned when you saw him.
She frowned. Well, I guess it must have been. Didn't really think about it, but yeah, I reckon it was. Sebastian made inquiries at the stables, but Cian O'Neill hadn't come to work that morning. He eventually tracked the lad to a tumble-down cottage off Wilderness Row, where he lived with his widowed mother and 5 younger siblings. Sebastian's knock was answered by the lad's mother, a rail-thin, worn-down woman with grey-threaded hair who looked 60, but was probably younger than 40, judging by the squalling infant in her arms. "Begging your pardon, me lord," she said, dropping a curtsy when Sebastian explained who he was and the purpose of his visit. "But I'm afraid you won't be getting much sense out of Cian. He didn't sleep a wink all night, just sat in the corner by the fire and shivered. Some constable came by here from Bow Street and tried to talk to him a bit ago, and the poor lad started babbling all sorts of nonsense about having seen the Dullahan." Sebastian had heard of the Dullahan, a figure in Irish folklore said to be a horseman dressed all in black and astride a black fire-breathing stallion. He rode the darkened lanes and byways, carrying his own head in his hands. According to legend, whenever the Dullahan stops, a man, woman, or child dies. Sebastian said, "I'd like to try talking to him." He knew by the worry pinching the woman's face that she'd rather have denied him, but she belonged to a class whose members had been trained since birth to obey their betters. She dropped a curtsy and stood back to let him enter. The cottage was clean but wretchedly poor, with low, heavy beams, a swept dirt floor, and a worm-eaten old table with benches that looked as if they'd been knocked together from scrap wood picked up off the street. Of one room only, the place had a mattress in an alcove half hidden behind a tattered curtain, and a pegged, roughly hewn ladder that led up to a loft. Cian O'Neill sat on a low 3-legged stool before the fire, his shoulders hunched forward, his hands thrust together between his tightly clasped knees. He was a fine-looking lad of 17 or 18, big and strapping and startlingly handsome, with clear blue eyes and golden hair that curled softly against his lean cheeks. He kept his attention fixed on the fire, as if oblivious to Devlin's approach. But when his mother touched him on the shoulder, he jerked violently and looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Here's a lord come to talk to you, Cian," she said gently, "about last night." The boy's gaze slid from her face to Sebastian. A spasm passed over his features,
the chest beneath his thin smock jerking visibly with his quick, agitated breathing. Sebastian said, "I just want to know if you saw anything, heard anything, that might help us figure out what happened last night." The boy opened his mouth, the air rasping in his constricted throat as he drew in a deep breath that came out in a high-pitched, terrified scream. Sebastian pressed a coin into the poor woman's hand and left. Chapter 7. "You aren't seriously suggesting that I might somehow know who killed Stanley or why? Good God." Henry Addington, 1st Viscount Sidmouth and Home Secretary of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze on the big man who sat at his ease in a tapestry-covered armchair beside the empty half of his Carlton House chambers. Charles, Lord Jarvis, fingered the handle of a diamond-studded quizzing-glass he'd lately taken to wearing on a ribbon around his neck. "You would have me believe you do not?" "Of course not." Jarvis pursed his lips. He was an unusually large man, impressive in both height and breadth, his face fleshy, his lips full and unexpectedly sensual, the aquiline nose he'd bequeathed to his daughter Hero, lending a harsh cast to his face. Addington might be Home Secretary, while Jarvis carried no official title, but Jarvis was by far the more powerful man. He owed his preeminence not to his kinship with the king, which was distant, but to the brilliance of his mind and the unflinching ruthlessness of the methods he was willing to use to protect the power and prestige of the monarchy at home and the interests of Britain abroad. The only thing that had kept the Prince Regent from suffering the same fate meted out to his fellow royals across the Channel was Jarvis, and most people knew it. Jarvis raised his quizzing-glass to one eye and regarded the Home Secretary through it. "You would have me believe this murder has nothing to do with you?" "Nothing." "The man was your cousin." A faint telltale line of colour appeared high on the Home Secretary's cheekbones. "We were not close. And his death in no way involves any affairs of state?" "No." Jarvis let the quizzing-glass fall. "You're quite certain of that?" "Yes." Jarvis rose to his feet. "You relieve my mind. If you should, however, discover you are mistaken, you will, of course, alert me at once." Sidmouth's jaw tightened. He was in his mid-50s now, his once dark hair turning silver, his waist grown thick, the flesh of his hands and face as soft and pale as any pampered gentlewoman's. But he had the jaw of a butcher or a prize-fighter, strong and powerful and pugnacious. "Of course," he said. "Good. That will be all." Addington bowed curtly and swept from the room. A moment later, the tall, dark-haired former hussar major who had been waiting in the antechamber appeared in the doorway. His name was Peter Archer, and he was one of several former military officers in Jarvis's employ. "Sidmouth is hiding something," said Jarvis, "and I want to know what it is." A faint smile curled the major's lips as he bowed. "Yes, my lord." Chapter 8. Hoping that Paul Gibson had made some progress in the post-mortem of Preston's body, Sebastian turned his horses toward the Tower of London, where the Irishman kept a small surgery in the shadow of the grim medieval fortress's soot-stained walls. The friendship between Sebastian and the former regimental surgeon dated back nearly 10 years, to the days when both men wore the king's colours and fought the king's wars from Italy to the West Indies to the Peninsula. Then a cannonball took off the lower part of Gibson's left leg, leaving him racked with pain and tormented by an increasingly serious opium addiction. In the end he left the army and come here to London, where he divided his time between his surgery and teaching anatomy at the city's hospitals. He knew more about the human body than anyone Sebastian had ever met, thanks in part to an ongoing series of illicit dissections performed on cadavers filched from the area's churchyards by resurrection men. Until that January, Gibson had lived alone, but he now shared the small ancient stone house beside his surgery with Alexis Sauvage, a beautiful, enigmatic and unconventional Frenchwoman who was as damaged in her own way as Gibson. Rather than chance an encounter with her, Sebastian cut through the narrow passage that ran along Gibson's house and led to the unkempt yard at the rear. Overgrown with weeds and a mute witness to the secrets buried there, the yard stretched down to a high stone wall that abutted the single-room outbuilding where Gibson performed both his legally sanctioned autopsies and his covert dissections. Through the open door he could hear the Irishman singing softly under his breath, "Magie la mère." The headless, naked body of Stanley Preston lay on the high stone table in the centre of the room. When Sebastian's shadow fell across it, Gibson broke off and looked up. "Ah, there you are, me lad," he said, exaggerating his brogue. "Thought I'd be seeing you soon enough." He was only several years older than Sebastian, but chronic pain had already touched his dark hair with grey at the temples and dug deep lines in his face. His opium addiction hadn't helped either, although Sebastian noticed he didn't look quite as emaciated as he had lately. Pausing in the doorway, Sebastian let his gaze drift around the cold room until he located Preston's head, cradled in an enamelled basin on a long shelf. In the last 12 hours, the face seemed to have sunk in on itself, taking on a waxy, greyish tinge. Sebastian swallowed and brought his gaze back to the rest of the cadaver. A small purple slit, clearly visible against the alabaster flesh, showed high on the man's chest. "He was stabbed?" said Sebastian. "Why the hell didn't I see that?" "Probably because he was so drenched in blood from his head being taken off, and because he was stabbed in the back. What you're seeing is where the tip of the blade came all the way through his body, but not by much, I'd say. It just barely sliced his waistcoat. If you'll help me turn him over, I'll show you." "That's quite all right. I'll take your word for it." Gibson grinned. "So that's what killed him," said Sebastian. "It might have eventually, but not right away. I suspect he fell when he was stabbed, and his killer finished him off by slitting his throat." Gibson paused. "Obviously he got a wee bit carried away and completely cut off the head." "With what? Any idea?" "My guess is a sword stick. The stab wound in the back is the right size. I'd say your killer ran him through with the sword stick, then used the same blade to slit his throat, slashing down as the poor man lay on the ground. Could be he wasn't intending to cut off the head. He was just trying to make sure Preston was dead. So why did he then pick up the head and put it on the bridge?" "Ah, nobody told me that part." Sebastian studied the ragged, truncated flesh of the cadaver's neck. He'd lopped off more heads than he'd cared to remember with a heavy cavalry sword swung from the back of a horse. But to chop the head off a man lying on the ground with a slim sword stick must surely be considerably more difficult. "How easy is it to cut off a head like that?" "Not easy at all, evidently. Took whoever did it at least a dozen blows, maybe more." "Lovely." Sebastian turned to stare out at the yard. The cloud cover from last night's storm was beginning to show signs of breaking up, but the sunlight was still weak and fitful. As he watched, a woman came out of the house and paused for a moment on the back stoop. She was small and slight, with a head of fiery red hair and the kind of pale skin more often seen in Scotland than in France. Her gaze met his, and he saw her nostrils flare, her lips tighten into a flat line as she picked up a basket and trowel, and moved to where he realized someone was nurturing a small plot of sweet peas and forget-me-nots along the house's rear wall. Sebastian said,
Does Madame Sauvage know you spent the last few years planting this yard with the remains of your dissections?"
"Aye, I told her. She says all the more reason to clean it up." Sebastian leaned one shoulder against the door jamb and watched her. He knew some of her history, but not all of it. Born in Paris, in the days before the Revolution, she'd trained as a physician in Italy, but because Britain refused to license female physicians, she was allowed to practice in London only as a midwife. Like Gibson, she was in her early 30s, and by her own account had already gone through 2 husbands and 2 lovers. All were dead now, one of them by Sebastian's hand. Gibson said, "And how is young Master Simon, Sincere?"
"He's an angel, until the clock strikes 6 in the evening, at which point he starts screaming bloody murder and is impossible to console until nearly midnight."
"Colicky, is he? It'll soon pass."
"I sincerely hope so."
The surgeon grinned and limped over to stand beside him. Gibson's gaze rested, like Sebastian's, on the woman now working the rich black soil near the house.
"I've asked Alexei to marry me 12 times, he said with a sigh, "but she won't hear of it." "Does she say why not?"
"She says all of her husbands have died."
"So have her lovers," thought Sebastian, although he didn't say it.
He shifted to study his friend's lean, pain-lined face.
"She said she could do something to help with the phantom pains from your missing leg."
His pain and his opium addiction.
"Has she tried?"
"She keeps wanting to, but it sounds daft to me. How can a box with mirrors possibly do any good?"
"It's worth making the attempt, isn't it?"
The Irishman simply shook his head and turned back to his work.
"I'll let you know if I find anything else."
Sebastian nodded and pushed away from the doorframe. But as he followed the narrow path to the gate, he was aware of Alexei Sauvage's gaze on him, silent and watchful. It often seemed to Sebastian that trying to solve a murder was somewhat akin to approaching a figure in the mist. At first, an indistinct, insubstantial blur, the murdered man or woman began to take form and emerge in detail only as Sebastian came to see the victim through the eyes of the various people who had known, loved, or hated him. At the moment, virtually all Sebastian knew about Stanley Preston was that the man was cousin to the Home Secretary, a widower and father of 2, who owned plantations in Jamaica, and was not in the habit of trying to fondle the pretty young barmaid at the local pub. Before he approached the dead man's grief-stricken daughter, Sebastian felt the need to learn more. And so his next stop was the home of Henrietta, the Dowager Duchess of Claiborne. One of the grandes dames of society, the Duchess had long maintained a relentless interest in the personal lives and antecedents of everyone who was anyone. Since she also possessed an awe-inspiring memory that deemed few details too trivial not to be retained forever, he couldn't think of anyone in London better able to tell him what he needed to know about Mr. Stanley Preston. Born Lady Henrietta Sincere, elder sister of the current Earl of Hendon, she was known to the world as Sebastian's aunt, although she was one of the few people aware of the fact that the relationship between them was in name only. She lived alone with an army of servants in a vast townhouse on Park Lane in Mayfair. Technically, the house belonged to her son, the current Duke of Claiborne, who resided at a far more modest address in Half Moon Street. An amiable, somewhat weak-willed gentleman, now of middle age, he was no match for the Dowager Duchess, who had every intention of dying in the house to which she had come as a bride some 55 years before. She was proud, nosy, perceptive, arrogant, judgmental, opinionated, and wise, and one of Sebastian's favourite people. He found her ensconced in a comfortable chair beside her drawing-room fire, an exquisite cashmere shawl draped about her stout shoulders, and a slim, blue-bound book in her hands.
"Good heavens, Aunt Henrietta," he said, stooping to kiss one subtly rouged and powdered cheek. "Have I caught you reading a novel?" Rather than put the book aside, she thrust one plump finger between the pages to mark her place. "I bought it to see what all the fuss is about. It has quite taken the ton by storm, you know, but I must confess to finding it unexpectedly diverting." Sebastian went to stand before the fire. "Who wrote it?" "No one knows. That's partly what makes it so delicious. It's simply ascribed to the author of Sense and Sensibility, and no one is yet to discover who she is." He reached to pick up one of the other 2 volumes resting on the table beside her and read the title, Pride and Prejudice. "Whoever it is obviously likes alliteration, and she has the most devastatingly wicked wit. Listen to this." She opened the book again. "They were, in fact, very fine ladies, had a fortune of £20,000, were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune, and their own, had been acquired by trade." Devastating indeed. I wonder, could you tear yourself away from this delightful tale long enough to tell me what you know of Mr. Stanley Preston? "Stanley Preston?" she repeated, looking up at him. "Whatever for?" "You haven't seen the morning papers?" "No, I've been reading this book. Why, what's happened to him?" "Someone cut off his head." "Good heavens! How terribly gauche." "Frightfully so. What do you know of him?" She laid the book aside, open and face down, although he noticed she gave it 1 or 2 reluctant glances before she brought her attention back to him. "Well, let's see. The family is old. He's from the Devonshire Prestons, you know, although his is a rather insignificant cadet branch." "Yet his cousin is Lord Sidmouth." She waved a dismissive hand. Obviously the Home Secretary's antecedents did not impress her. "Yes, but Sidmouth himself was only recently raised to the peerage. His father was a mere physician." "So where did Preston acquire his wealth?" "His father married a merchant's daughter. The woman was dreadfully vulgar, I'm afraid, but quite an heiress. The elder Preston invested her inheritance in land in the West Indies, and did very well for himself, as a result of which he was able to marry his own son, Stanley, to the daughter of an impoverished baron. Wealth acquired from trade being seen as something vile and shameful that can be magically cleansed by investment in land, even when that land happens to be worked by slaves." She frowned at him. "Really, Sebastian, it's not as if he were engaged in the slave trade. Slavery is perfectly legal in the West Indies. The French tried to do away with it, and look what happened to them. A bloodbath." "True," said Sebastian. "What was the name of this baron's daughter? I gather she's dead." "Mary Pierce. Lovely young woman. In the end, the marriage was surprisingly successful. Preston positively doted on her, but she died in childbirth some 7 or 8 years ago. I've often wondered why he never remarried. He's still quite attractive and vigorous for his age." "Not any more." "Don't be vulgar, Devlin." He gave a soft huff of laughter. "Tell me about the daughter. What's her name?" "Anne. She must be in her early 20s by now, still unmarried, I'm afraid, and in serious danger of being left on the shelf. Not that anyone is exactly surprised." "Why? Is she ill-favoured?" "Oh, she was pretty enough when she was young, I suppose. But Preston never did move in the highest circles, and Anne has a tendency to be rather quiet, and a tad strange, to be frank." "Strange? In what way?" "Let's say she's more like her father than her mother, and of course it hasn't helped that her portion from her mother is not large." I was under the impression Preston's holdings in Jamaica are substantial.
They are, but that will all go to the son.
I assume the man was a Tory.
I should hope so.
Although, unlike Sidmouth, I don't believe he was overly interested in affairs of state. His passion was collecting.
Collecting?
What did he collect?
Curiosities of all sorts, although mainly antiquities. He had a special interest in items that once belonged to famous people. I'm told he has a bullet taken from the body of Lord Nelson after Trafalgar, a handkerchief some ghoulish soul dipped in Louis XVI's blood at the guillotine, that sort of thing. He even has heads. Sebastian paused in the act of leaning down to throw more coal on the fire.
Heads? What sort of heads?
Those with historical significance.
You mean people's heads?
I'm told he has Oliver Cromwell, amongst others. But don't ask me who else, because I've never seen them. They say he keeps them displayed in glass cases, and— She broke off. How did you say he died?
Someone cut off his head.
Dear me. She readjusted her shawl. I take it you've involved yourself in this murder investigation?
I have, yes.
Amanda won't like it. That girl of hers is starting her 2nd season. And Amanda blames you for Stephanie's failure to go off last year. Sebastian's older sister Amanda was not one of his admirers. He said,
From what I observed, I'd say my niece was enjoying her 1st season far too much to settle down and bring it all to an end.
Yes, I'm afraid she's your mother all over again. When Sebastian remained silent, she picked up her book and said, Now go away. I want to get back to my reading. He laughed and kissed her cheek again.
If you're not careful, Aunt, people are going to start accusing you of being bookish.
Never happen. He turned toward the door, but before he reached it, she said, Is it wise, involving yourself in this murder, Devlin? You've a wife and child to think of now. He paused to look back at her.
I am thinking of them. Whoever did this is not someone I want roving the city.
We pay constables and magistrates to take care of that sort of thing.
I don't believe that means the rest of us can simply abdicate all responsibility for our own safety.
Perhaps. Yet, why you, Devlin? Why? But he only shook his head and left her there, her attention once more captured by the pages of her book. Chapter 9.
We costermongers is a proud lot, the wizened old woman told Hero. Ain't no doubt about it. We all knows each other, and we keeps ourselves to ourselves.
Her name was Mattie Robinson, and she sat perched on a 3-legged stool behind an apple stall formed by laying a flat wicker tray across 2 upended crates. She'd been born, she said, in the year they sent poor Dick Turpin up the ladder to bed, which Hero figured made her somewhere in her 70s. She wore a man's tattered greatcoat and had a plaid shawl knotted about her head, and still she shivered as if the cold from all the decades spent sitting at her stall had irrevocably settled deep in her bones. She'd agreed to talk to Hero for 2 shillings, which was, she admitted, considerably more than an entire day's take.
I've kept me stall here at the corner of St. Martin's Lane and Chandos Street e'er since me leg was crushed by a gentlewoman's carriage.
She shook her head, as if the ways of the gentry were a puzzle to her.
Didn't even stop to see if I were alive or dead.
When was that?
The year after me Greta was born. Before that I used to work the Strand.
Hero had learned enough by now to know what costermongers meant when they spoke of working a street or district.
Me Nathan was alive then, said Mattie. He had his own hand-barrow, you know. We were doing grand, with 2 nice rooms and our own furniture.
Her watery brown eyes clouded with memories of a loss that was now some half a century in the past.
We was even sending our boy Jack to school, but after I was laid up for the better part of a year, we had to pledge all the furniture and move to an attic room in Hemmings Row. And poor Jack, he had to leave school and start to work with his da.
How old was Jack?
6. Before that, Nathan used to hire a lad every morning at the market. A coster needs a lad, you see, to help watch the barrow, else thieves will steal him blind when his back is turned. And a boy's voice carries better than a man's. All of them years of shouting ruins a coster's throat real quick.
Hero checked her list of questions. How many hours are you here at your store?
This time of year? I'm usually here from 8 in the morning till 10 at night. My Greta, she gets up early and goes to market to get me apples and things. I don't know what I'd do without her. I can hobble down here by myself, but 'tain't no way I could haul me basket of apples from market.
Is Greta a coster as well?
Aye, she works both at wharfs with her da's barrow. Ain't many women can handle a barrow, but me Greta's always been a strapping lass. Course she's getting on in years now herself. Don't know how much longer she'll be able to keep it up. And then, what's to become of us?
She never married or had children? A gleam of amusement lit the older woman's eyes.
'Tain't one coster out of 10 is married, proper like. Most see it as a waste of money, could be better spent buying stock. No parson never said words over me and Nathan, but it didn't make no difference to us or to anybody else.
And Greta?
Matty shook her head. She always says costers treat their wives worse than cheap servants, and ain't no man ever going to beat her.
Hero suspected those sentiments spoke volumes about the behaviour of the late Nathan Robinson, but all she said was, "What about your son, Jack? Is he a costermonger as well?" The old woman turned her head to spit, as if needing to clear a foul taste from her mouth before she could speak.
Me Jack was impressed by His Majesty back in the American War. I ain't seen nor heard nothing from him since. I reckon he's dead, but ain't nobody ever told us for certain.
"I'm sorry," said Hero. Again that faint sparkle of amusement.
"What for? You ain't His Majesty now, is ya?"
Hero laughed out loud. "No." A donkey in the street beside them began to bray loudly. "What do you normally have for breakfast and supper?" The question obviously struck Matty as rather daft, but she answered readily enough,
"Bread and butter, same as everybody else. A few herrings now and then. Course, if we've had too many days of wet weather, we don't eat nothing. Can't eat up our stock money now, can we? Then what would we do?"
Hero focused on recording the woman's answer, being careful not to allow any emotion to show on her face. She'd thought, when she first began this series of articles, that she understood the plight of the city's poor, but she knew now that she had never appreciated just how thin the line between survival and starvation was for a vast segment of London's population. A few pence a day could make the difference between supper and a place to sleep, and a cold, hungry night spent huddled beneath the arches of the Adelphi.
Matty said, "The nice thing about hunger is that while you feel it at first, it goes off after a while if you've nothing to eat. Dunno why, but I ain't one to question the goodness of God."
"Do you go hungry often?"
"Mostly in the winter, when we've had a long spell of wet weather. And of course in winter you needs fire and candles, and they're so dear. There's many a night Greta and I just go to bed. But I ain't complaining. There's plenty worse off than us. At least we ain't got no little ones to worry about."
Hero stared off down the street to where a wagon loaded with lumber jolted heavily over the wet paving. There were more questions she'd intended to ask the old woman, but sometimes the frank recitals of bad luck and loss and endless struggle threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you," she said, and gave Matty another shilling before walking away. After the squalor and desperation of St. Martin's Parish,
There was something vaguely obscene about the opulence of the Prince of Wales's London residence on Pall Mall. As Hero followed a liveried and powdered footman through the silk-hung marble corridors of Carlton House, she found she couldn't stop thinking about Matty Robinson and Greta and the boy Jack, dragged away from his family to fight in one of His Majesty's wars so long ago. The chambers set aside for the exclusive use of her father, Charles, Lord Jarvis, lay at the top of a sweeping grand staircase, ornamented with exquisite plasterwork and copious gilding. She found him seated at a delicate French desk that, like so much else in the palace, had been supplied to the Prince of Wales by the same Parisian marchand Mercier who'd served as interior decorator to the ill-fated Marie Antoinette. Jarvis looked up at her entrance and dismissed the footman with a curt nod, his eyes narrowing as his gaze travelled over her. "You're looking surprisingly well, despite Devlin's insistence on using you as a milk cow for his son." "The decision was mine, and you know it," she said, slipping off her pelisse. Jarvis simply grunted and set aside his quill. "I had hoped motherhood would have a domesticating effect on you. But I'm told you've undertaken to write a new article, this one on the blackguard tribe of costers infesting our streets." "And who told you that, Papa?" she asked, with a silken assumption of ignorance that brought an answering gleam of amusement to his intense grey eyes. Everyone in England knew Jarvis directed a vast network of spies and informants who reported not to the Prince or Downing Street, but to Jarvis alone. The smile faded. He said, "No good can come of this project of yours, you know." "I disagree." She unwrapped the brown paper parcel she had brought with her to reveal the thin strip of old inscribed lead. "I was wondering if you know what this is." He stood, taking the old metal band in his hands and carrying it to the window. She watched him turn the upper surface to the light, his lips pursing as he ran his thumb over the scrollwork. Jarvis's face never betrayed his thoughts or emotions, but she knew him well, so that very lack of any of the traces of surprise or interest one would expect told her she'd come to the right place. He said, "Where did you get this?" "It was found last night at Bloody Bridge, near where Mr. Stanley Preston was murdered. You've seen it before, haven't you?" He fingered one sliced end of the strap, then set it aside, and reached for his handkerchief to carefully wipe his hands. "Devlin's involved you in this murder, has he?" "I involved myself." He tucked away his handkerchief. She said, "It's always been my understanding that the final resting place of Charles I is unknown." "It was, up until a week or so ago." Jarvis clasped his hands behind his back and shifted his gaze out the window to the forecourt below. 3 years ago, after the death of the Princess Amelia, His Majesty decided to build an elaborate new royal vault at Windsor Castle, beneath the Wolsey Chapel at St. George's. As originally constructed, the vault could only be accessed from outside the chapel, but the Prince Regent recently decided to install a new entrance in the form of a sloping passage that opens from the choir of St. George's itself. He paused to glance over at her. "You know Princess Augusta is gravely ill and unlikely to recover?" "Yes," said Hero. Princess Augusta, elder sister to King George III, was both aunt and mother-in-law to the regent, and had taken refuge in England after the death of her husband, the Duke of Brunswick, in battle against Napoleon. Because of her imminent death, the workers were urged to proceed quickly. Several days ago they accidentally broke through a thin brick wall into the vault containing Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. The vault's general location was known, but over the years its exact placement had been forgotten. He slipped a delicate gold snuff-box, inlaid with a swirl of seed pearls, from his pocket, and flicked open the lid with his thumbnail. According to records, the vault should have contained only Henry and his favourite queen. But in looking through the aperture they'd made, The workmen were surprised to see not 2, but 3 adult-sized coffins.
The third being that of Charles I?
As it happens, yes.
He lifted a delicate pinch of snuff to one nostril and sniffed.
The dean of the chapel immediately contacted Carlton House. Given the importance of the find, I personally made the journey out to Windsor to inspect the discovery on behalf of the prince.
And?
Henry VIII's coffin is in decidedly poor condition. You can see where a crude opening had at some point been cut in the wall of the vault immediately above it and then filled in. Frankly, I suspect the opening was made by the men who lowered the 3rd coffin into the vault, and they accidentally dropped it on Henry. Jane Seymour, however, was off to one side and intact.
And the 3rd coffin?
The 3rd coffin was still covered by its dusty black velvet pall, which, upon being raised, revealed a plain lead coffin encircled by a strap inscribed King Charles, 1648.
He nodded to the metal scroll.
Like this.
You had the coffin opened?
Not at all. Indeed, the dean and canons have strict instructions to guard the site well. The prince is anxious to personally hold a formal examination of the contents of the 3rd coffin as soon as the construction of the passage is complete. And Princess Augusta is dead and buried, of course.
Why? I mean, why examine the remains of Charles but not the others? Jarvis tucked the snuff-box into his pocket.
I'm afraid His Highness has long maintained a rather morbid fascination with the Stuarts. He says he wishes to answer some historical questions, but I suspect he's mainly driven by a desire to look upon the mortal remains of a British royal so unpopular as to lose his head at the hands of his subjects. His gaze returned to the metal fragment. If this strap has indeed come from Charles's coffin, the regent will not be pleased to learn that someone has interfered with the burial before he's had the chance to do so himself.
Do you think there could be political implications to this? Asked Hero.
Anything involving the Stuarts is always a cause for concern, as is the relationship between Stanley Preston and the Home Secretary.
He watched her fold the section of lead back into its brown paper wrapping, then said,
I don't like your involvement in this, Hero.
She looked over at him. If it were up to you, I would neither write about the situation of London's poor, nor investigate murders, or even nurse my own newborn son. Pray tell, how would you have me pass my days?
Shopping in Bond Street, embarking on an endless round of morning calls, reading the latest lurid romance. Surely you know better than I how women of your station spend their time.
She smiled. I enjoy shopping and reading.
Then you should do more of it.
I'm not like that, she said, suddenly serious. His lips flattened into a tight line.
You should have been born a boy.
I like being a woman just fine. She kissed his cheek, then carefully readjusted the tilt of her hat. Will you be sending someone out to Windsor? He declined to answer her question. But later, as she was leaving Carlton House, she saw one of the tall former guardsmen in Jarvis's employ crossing the courtyard at a run. Chapter 10. Once, years before, when Sebastian was a small boy barely out of short coats, he befriended a tall, strapping young footman named Luge. Sebastian was the son of an earl, while Luge was in service to Sebastian's grandmother, the Dowager Countess of Hendon. But for a brief, shining moment out of time, man and boy had connected in a way that transcended such ordinary impediments as station, age, and race. Afterwards, Sebastian would wonder at the good-natured patience of the handsome, ebony-skinned footman who had indulged the boundless curiosity of a small boy, who could listen for hours to Luge's tales of the sun-drenched sands and the crystal-clear seas of Barbados, the island of his birth. Luge had been only 8 years old when the Dowager Countess purchased him at a slave market in Bridgetown and brought the child back to England as her page. Once he even showed Sebastian the brand on his shoulder and grinned as the boy reached out to trace the initials of the master who had marked Luge as his property, the way Sebastian's father marked his own horses and cattle. "Did it hurt?" Sebastian asked in awe. "I reckon," said Luge, "but I don't remember. I was still little." Sebastian had seen brands on ragged men and women in the streets, usually a T for thief or an M for manslaughter, but the thought of anyone doing that to a small child horrified him so much that he stayed away from Luge for a few days. And the next time Sebastian visited his grandmother, he was told that Luge had taken off his powdered wig, set it atop his folded velvet livery, and simply walked off into the gathering dusk. The Dowager advertised for his return, although no one paid much attention any more to advertisements for runaway slaves. A succession of court cases had reinforced the popular belief that the air of England was too pure for a slave to breathe. But what was true of the air of England was not true of the air in England's colonies. Even those who supported the freeing of England's 10,000 to 15,000 slaves often grew faint-hearted at the thought of the financial havoc that would result from the emancipation of those who toiled to produce the sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, and rice that made England wealthy and powerful. Some 20 years after Luge walked away to freedom, Sebastian had landed with his regiment in Barbados to find the island little changed from the colony Luge had described. A dazzling sun still soaked golden sands lapped by achingly blue waters, and vast weathered docks swarmed with ebony-skinned men in canvas trousers, their sweat-sheened backs crisscrossed with the scars of past floggings. Such sights did not shock Sebastian, for the lash was applied with brutal frequency to the men who enlisted or were impressed into His Majesty's army or navy. Even English women were still sometimes stripped naked to the waist and whipped at the cart's tail. But as he climbed through Bridgetown's dusty streets, past low buildings with long windows shaded by deep verandas and shuttered against the oppressive heat, he came upon an open square crowded with African men, women, and children of all ages. Some sat blankly, staring into space, while others huddled together, mothers hugging infants to their breasts, as solemn, wide-eyed toddlers clutched their skirts. A few planters, sun-reddened faces shadowed by broad-brimmed hats, circulated amongst them. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and human sweat and wretched despair, and Sebastian drew up abruptly as the realization of what he was witnessing slammed into him. A young woman and a good-looking boy of perhaps 8 or 10 were pushed up onto the block. Transfixed by fascination and horror, Sebastian could only watch as the auctioneer expressed a wish to sell mother and child together. But the woman had a withered right arm that discouraged buyers, whereas interest in her handsome son was strong. The auctioneer finally agreed to sell the two separately, and silent, helpless tears rolled down the woman's cheeks as a spirited bidding began for the child. Then the hammer fell, and the successful bidder, a fat man with bad teeth and an egg-stained waistcoat, pushed forward to collect his new property. "No!" the mother screamed, lunging forward as the boy was led away. "No! You can't take him! Oh, please don't take him! Please!" Hands caught her, dragged her back. She fought wildly, uselessly, her face contorted with hopeless anguish. For one suspended moment her frantic gaze met Sebastian's over the heads of the onlookers, and he felt a wash of helpless shame for his nation, his race, his time, and his own inaction, that he'd known even then would never leave him. Now, as Sebastian drew his curricle up before the impressive home of Stanley Preston, he found himself remembering both Luge and that nameless, frantic mother.
This graceful, half-timbered Elizabethan manor might be half a world away from the cane fields and slave markets of the West Indies, but those cruelties had helped pay for it. Most of Hans Town's prosperous up-and-coming residents were happy to occupy one of the newly constructed, identical brick terraces that lined Sloane Street and the new squares. But not Stanley Preston. He had chosen as his residence a grand relic of a bygone age. Known as Alford House, it stood in the well-tended remnants of what must originally have been a much larger garden, its brick walkways now gently sunken and mossy, its climbing roses twisted and knotty with the passage of the years. There were other such grand houses in the area, but most had been turned into schools or hospitals, their noble owners having long ago fled to the likes of Berkeley Square or Mount Street. Sebastian half expected to find the murdered man's daughter Anne too prostrate with grief and shock to receive him, but she appeared, after only a few moments, a slim figure in a simple black mourning gown, looking pale and shaken, but admirably self-possessed. She accepted his condolences and his apologies for disturbing her with a graciousness he couldn't help but admire, and showed him into an elegant 16th-century drawing-room with an elaborately moulded plaster ceiling and dark panelled walls hung with a collection of old-fashioned duelling pistols and swords. "Father loved this house," she said, sinking onto a tapestry-covered settee near the room's massive stone fireplace. "It's old and draughty and frightfully unfashionable, but he didn't care. It's rumoured Charles II actually hid here once during the Civil War, you know. There's even supposed to be a secret passage somewhere, although Father never could find it." "Your father was interested in the Stuarts?" asked Sebastian, adjusting the tails of his morning coat as he settled in a nearby chair. "He was interested in anyone famous, or infamous. In fact, the more infamous or tragic, the more interested Father was." She was more attractive than his aunt's word had led him to expect, although undoubtedly shy, even nervous in his presence. Her hair was the colour of sun-warmed oak, cut short so that it curled softly around her face, her eyes wide-set and deep and swollen from her tears. She said, "I keep thinking, if only Father had come with us last night to Lady Farningham's musical evening, he'd still be alive." "Do you know why he chose not to attend?" An unexpected smile lit up the depths of her mossy green eyes. "Father loathed musical evenings. He used to say that if he ended up in hell, the devil would torment him by forcing him to spend the rest of eternity listening to young ladies play harps." Her smile faded, became something painful. "I had the impression he was planning a quiet evening at home. I can't imagine what would have taken him to Bloody Bridge." "So it really is called that?" "It is, yes. I've heard it's a corruption of Blandel Bridge, but its history is certainly bloody enough. Several people were killed there by footpads at the end of the last century, and it was the scene of repeated skirmishes during the Civil War. Father was always poking around there, finding rusty old spurs and bridle bits he said must have been lost in the fighting, but obviously he wouldn't have been doing that at night." "I understand he was something of a collector." Again that soft glow of remembered affection warmed her features. "I sometimes think Father would have been happiest as a wizened old eccentric, charging the public a shilling to gawk at his cabinet of curiosities. He loved nothing more than showing off his collection. Mamma always insisted he keep all but the most decorative items out of her drawing-room, and he's honoured her memory by continuing to respect her wishes in that. But I'm afraid the rest of the house is overflowing with his various collections." "You say he was interested in relics of the Stuarts?" "The Stuarts and the Tudors. They were his particular obsession. In fact, he has an entire gallery devoted to them." "May I see it?" If she was surprised by the request, she was too well-bred to show it. "Yes, of course."
She led the way to a long panelled room lined with glass cases filled with everything from daggers and maces to snuff-boxes and opera glasses. Peering into the nearest case, he could see a dagger said to have belonged to James I, a carved and gilded angel from the reredos of a vanished monastery, and a faded silk pincushion with a neatly printed label that read, "Given by Mary Queen of Scots to her lady-in-waiting the morning of her execution." She said, "When father was a boy, an aged cousin gave him a stirrup said to have been used by Richard III at Bosworth Field. He was so taken with the idea of possessing something that had once belonged to such an illustrious historical figure that it became his lifelong passion." Sebastian let his gaze drift along the rows of cases to where a blue velvet curtain hung at the far end of the room. He didn't see any heads. He said, "I'm told your father had certain relics of Oliver Cromwell." "Only this." She moved to the end of the gallery to draw back the long fall of velvet. "He had the curtain installed after a dinner guest wandered in here by mistake, saw them, and fainted." The curtain opened to reveal 3 small glass and mahogany display cases mounted on pedestals. Each contained a severed human head resting in artfully arranged folds of the same blue velvet. "That's Cromwell," she said, indicating the case on the right. The head was unexpectedly small, as if it had shrunk as it dried, the flesh so darkened as to look almost black, the cheeks sunken, the eyes reduced to mere slits. Yet there was something about the slope of the forehead, the curve of the skull, that eerily echoed the painting Sebastian had seen of the Lord Protector. She said, "Most of the traitors' heads that were displayed on pikes eventually rotted, but Cromwell died a natural death and was embalmed. It wasn't until after the Restoration that his body was dragged from Westminster Abbey and hung in chains at Tyburn. Then the head was impaled along with those of 2 other regicides on spikes and mounted above Westminster." "Not London Bridge?" "No. I suppose Westminster was chosen since it was the scene of their crime. The 3 heads were up there for decades as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to imitate their deeds." Sebastian shifted his gaze to the young woman beside him. She was utterly unperturbed by a ghoulish sight the likes of which would cause many gentlewomen to fall into strong hysterics. But then he realized she had grown up surrounded by her father's bizarre collection. It was a side of Miss Anne Preston that was both unexpected and more than a little thought-provoking. He brought his attention back to the remnants of the man who had once butchered men, women, and children the length of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Traces of hair and the moustache remained, but the ears and part of the nose were gone. He said, "All those years on a spike above Westminster Hall appeared to have taken quite a toll." "Actually, much of the damage is fairly recent. The head was owned for a time by the actor Samuel Russell, and he was said to be in the habit of getting foxed and passing it around at his dinner parties. I gather he and his guests dropped it a few times." "So how did the Lord Protector go from being on a spike above Westminster to being an object of conversation at an actor's drunken dinner parties?" "Sometime during the reign of James II there was a violent storm. The high winds broke the spike, and the head fell down." "I'm surprised it didn't smash." "I suspect it would have, had it hit the pavement, but it was caught by a guard who happened to be patrolling below. Evidently his sympathies still lay with the Puritans, because he took the head home and hid it. There was quite a hue and cry when its loss was discovered in the morning. They even offered a reward for the head's return." "Why? I mean, why would they care at that point?" "I can't imagine. Perhaps they feared it might become a relic. But the reward wasn't enough to tempt the guard, and he kept it hidden. Father could have told you how it had got from the guard to Russell, but I've forgotten." Sebastian shifted to the next pedestal. This head was more gruesome than the last, being light brown in colour rather than black, and less shrunken, with its nearly toothless mouth gaping open in a frightful grin. The neatly engraved brass plaque on the front of the case said simply, Henri IV. Sebastian stared at it. That's Henri IV, the French king? Yes. How did your father get him? I thought he was buried along with the rest of France's royals at the Basilica of Saint-Denis in Paris. He was, but when the revolutionaries broke open all the royal tombs and tossed the contents into a common grave, someone, with a fondness for good King Henri, saved his head and smuggled it out of the country. Why? Her face lit up with silent laughter. You obviously don't understand the mentality of collectors. Do you? Not entirely, but after years of observing Father, I'd say much of the fascination comes from the way old items can make us feel closer to the past. Sebastian thought he was beginning to understand why Anne Preston was generally regarded as being both quiet and a bit strange. She must have learned long ago that this sort of conversation didn't play out well in London's drawing rooms. They shifted to the third pedestal. This head was perhaps the best preserved and the most gruesome of the three, its eyelids half closed, its lips pulled away from the teeth as if frozen in a rictus of agony. At the back of the neck, Sebastian could see quite clearly a deep cut above the one that had severed the head from the body, where the executioner's first stroke had obviously failed in its object. The case was unlabelled. "Who is this?" asked Sebastian. This was Father's most recent acquisition. It's believed to be the Duke of Suffolk, father to Lady Jane Grey. He was executed by Queen Mary in the Tower of London. So were a lot of other people. One would think you could fill a room with the heads of Mary's victims alone. True, but their heads didn't usually survive. They were typically parboiled, set up on spikes above London Bridge, and then eventually thrown into the river. But not Suffolk. No. His head was buried with the rest of his body at Holy Trinity in the Minories. Father said it probably survived so well because it fell into a box of sawdust, and the tannins preserved it. Sebastian let his gaze drift again around that macabre cabinet of curiosities, but he didn't see anything similar to the metal band he'd found at Bloody Bridge. He said, "What do you know of an old piece of thin lead, perhaps 1.5 feet in length and 3 or 4 inches wide, bearing the inscription, King Charles, 1648. She looked puzzled. "I've never heard of such a thing." "Why?" "It was found near where your father was killed." She was reaching to draw the curtain across the display pedestals, but at his words she paused, her fist clenching on the rich velvet cloth. "Is it true, what they're saying, that whoever killed Father also cut off his head?" "I'm afraid so." "Who would do such a thing?" "Can you think of anyone with whom your father might have quarrelled recently?" "No, no one," she said quickly. Too quickly. "You're certain?" he asked, watching her closely. "Yes, of course." "If you think of anyone, you will let me know." "If I think of anyone?" She busied herself with closing the curtain, but he noticed that her hand was no longer steady, and it was obvious that the nervousness he'd glimpsed earlier had returned, tightening the features of her face and agitating her breathing. At first he had mistaken her nervousness for the shyness of a young woman who felt ill at ease in company. Now he realized it was because she was afraid. Afraid of him, and of what he might learn. Chapter 11. "He collected heads?" Sir Henry Lovejoy's already high-pitched voice rose to a shrill squeak. "Men should be buried, not put on display as if they were in the same category as hunting trophies." "I suspect he didn't see the heads as all that different from the daggers and pincushions he also collected," said Sebastian. The two men were walking up Bow Street toward the public office. The footpaths were still dark and wet from the latest rain, with grey clouds pressing low on the city, and promising more. Lovejoy was silent for a moment, as if trying, and failing, to understand such a mentality.
"It's a disturbing coincidence that the man should collect the heads of historical figures only to have someone cut off his own."
"If it is a coincidence." Sir Henry hunched his shoulders against the damp, blustery wind.
"Most of Preston's servants had a half-day off on Sunday, but according to the butler, Preston went out for some hours on the day of his death. Unfortunately, he took a hackney rather than his own carriage, so unless we can trace the jarvey, we're unlikely to know where he went. He returned at approximately 4 in the afternoon and spent some time puttering around with his collections until dining with his daughter at 7. Then at something like 9 in the evening, or perhaps past, he went out again, walking this time, and stopped in an old public house just off Sloane Street."
"The Monster?"
"As it happens, yes. You've heard of it?"
"Molly Watson told me he went there regularly. It sounds like the sort of place likely to appeal to someone with Preston's interests." Sir Henry nodded.
"It dates back to the days of the dissolution. They say the name is actually a corruption of the monastery."
"How long was he there?"
"Not long. According to the barman, he fell into an argument with another gentleman in the tap-room and stormed off shortly after 10. Fortunately, the gentleman in question is a regular patron of the establishment, so the barman was able to identify him as a banker by the name of Austen. Henry Austen."
The name was unfamiliar to Sebastian.
"What do you know of him?" "I've had one of the lads looking into him. He's the son of a Hampshire clergyman, originally trained for the church himself, but joined the militia at the beginning of the war with France. Served a number of years, although he only saw action in Ireland. I gather he was involved in handling payroll and got caught up in the Duke of York scandal. That's when he resigned his commission and went into banking. He's done quite well for himself. His main bank is in Henrietta Street, here in the city, but he also has branches in various country towns such as Alton and Hythe."
"What's his connection with Preston?"
"That I don't know. He seems a rather good-humoured, even-tempered chap from all we've been able to discover, but I've kept the constables away from him so far. Thought it might be better to let you have a go at him first."
The bells of the city's churches began to toll, counting out the hour in a rolling cascade of sound as they drew up before the Bow Street public office.
Lovejoy said, "There is one thing about Austen that may or may not be pertinent, but is nonetheless rather disturbing."
"Oh?"
"His wife is the widow of a French count."
"Please don't tell me he lost his head as well."
"I'm afraid so. He was guillotined in 1794. I gather she's been ill for quite some time and may even be dying. Austen has his sister up from Hampshire to stay with them and help."
"What do you know about her?"
"The sister? I gather she's quite unremarkable. A spinster by the name of Jane. Miss Jane Austen."
Sebastian went first to the Austen Bank on Henrietta Street in Covent Garden, only to be told by a plump, supercilious clerk with heavily oiled, sandy hair that Mr. Austen was currently unavailable.
"Is he out,
or simply not receiving?" asked Sebastian.
The clerk sniffed. "I'm afraid I really can't say."
He started to turn away, a sheaf of papers in his hands.
"Can't or won't?"
The icy menace in Sebastian's voice brought the clerk to an abrupt halt, his chin sagging in a way that caused his mouth to gape open, his pale blue eyes widening as his gaze met Sebastian's. Sebastian said, "Consider your response very carefully."
He's not in today, truly. He was scheduled to visit one of our branches down in Hampshire this morning, and I can only assume he went."
"Where does he live?" The man swallowed hard enough to bob his Adam's apple visibly up and down.
"I don't think I should answer that."
Sebastian gave the young man a smile that showed his teeth. "Actually, I think you should." The papers the clerk had been holding slipped from his fingers to flutter to the floor.
Sloane Street. Number 64, Sloane Street. The keeper of the Hyde Park Turnpike is going to think we're up to something avy-cavy, said Tom, as Sebastian turned his horses toward Handstown for the third time that day.
Very likely, agreed Sebastian, guiding his pair around a slow collier's wagon. The Austen house lay halfway down Sloane Street, not far from Sloane Square, and the narrow, haunted lane that led to Bloody Bridge. One of a long line of terraces, built late in the previous century, it had neat white-framed windows and a shiny front door, and was in every respect what one might expect of a prosperous up-and-coming banker. The door was opened by a young and rather inexperienced housemaid, who confirmed the bank clerk's information, saying breathlessly, "I'm sorry, me lord, but the master left at the crack of dawn, he did." When Sebastian then asked to see Mr. Austen's sister instead, the girl grew so flustered she dropped the card he'd handed her. She retrieved the card with a stammered apology and hurried away, only to return a moment later and escort him up to an elegant octagonal drawing-room. The salon was expensively furnished in the latest style, with Egyptian-inspired settees covered in peach and lime-striped silk, ornately carved gilt mirrors, and an exquisite collection of French porcelains. The only odd note came from a small, rather plain writing desk that rested on a round, inlaid rosewood table positioned before the windows so that it overlooked the garden. At Sebastian's entrance, the woman seated beside it thrust whatever she'd been working on beneath the desk's slanted lid so quickly that the corners of some of the pages were left protruding. "Lord Devlin," she said, rising from her chair to come forward and greet him. Like the plain writing desk, Miss Jane Austen looked vaguely out of place in the room, both more comfortable and less ostentatious than her surroundings. Somewhere in her mid to late 30s, she had an attractive pixie face, framed by short dark hair that curled from beneath a spinster's crisp white cap. Her cheeks were abnormally ruddy, her dress neat but not particularly fashionable, her dark eyes calm and assessing in a way that told him this was a woman accustomed to observing and analyzing her fellow men. "I'm sorry my brother isn't here to meet with you," she said, "but he left for Alton this morning, and isn't expected back until tomorrow evening."
"I appreciate your taking the time to speak to me instead," said Sebastian, settling in the chair she indicated. "I understand your brother was acquainted with Stanley Preston."
She sank onto the edge of a nearby settee, her hands nestled together in her lap. "Yes. My sister-in-law was great friends with the late Mrs. Preston, you see."
"She died in childbirth?"
"She did, yes. It was quite tragic. Their daughter Anne was only 15 at the time. It's a difficult age for a young girl to be without a mother, and my cousin has attempted in the years since to stand in her friend's stead."
"Your cousin?"
"I beg your pardon. I should have explained. My sister-in-law, Eliza, is also my cousin. Her mother and my father were sister and brother." Sebastian studied Miss Jane Austen's small, expressive face. It was difficult to think of this quiet, provincial vicar's daughter as someone whose first cousin had been married to a French count, guillotined in the Revolution. He said,
"You've met Mr. Preston yourself?"
"At various times over the years, yes."
"What manner of man was he?"
"Mr. Preston?" She reached for a nearby embroidery frame, using the movement, he suspected, to give herself time to consider her response. "I would say his character was very much that of a devout and honest man. In truth, he had many admirable qualities. He was utterly devoted to his children and the memory of his dead wife. He was extraordinarily well read on a number of subjects, particularly history. And he was responsible and moderate in most things, with one notable exception, of course."
"You mean his passion for collecting?"
Her eyes crinkled in quiet amusement. "Yes, that is what I was referring to." Sebastian found himself smiling.
Now that you've satisfied the proprieties by listing his admirable qualities, perhaps you could tell me some of his less admirable traits?"
She took up her needle. "We all have our imperfections and idiosyncrasies, Lord Devlin, but I hope I am neither so unjust as to fault a man for falling short of perfection, nor so uncharitable as to catalogue his minor failings after his death."
"Yet if everyone persists in painting Stanley Preston as a saint, I am unlikely to ever discover who killed him."
She focused her attention on the neat stitches she was laying in her embroidery. "Well, I suppose you could say he had a tendency to be quarrelsome. He was also proud and socially ambitious, but in that, I suspect, he was not so different from most other men of his station."
"A lowering reflection, but sadly true, I fear."
He saw again that answering gleam of amusement in her eyes. She said, "The truth is, he was still a likeable man for all that. There was no real malice in him." Sebastian wondered if the slaves on Preston's Jamaican plantations would agree with that assessment, but all he said was,
"Have you seen his collection of heads?"
He couldn't imagine someone as prosaic and sensible as Miss Jane Austen fainting at such a sight. "I have, yes. I've often pondered why he kept them. At first I assumed he was driven by philosophical motives, that he derived some sort of salutary lesson from the contemplation of such tangible evidence that even the world's most powerful men are eventually reduced to nothing but shriveled flesh and bone. But I finally came to realize that he actually collected them for essentially the same reason rustics will travel miles to see a two-headed calf, or pay a sixpence to gawk at a hairy woman displaying herself at a fair."
"And why is that?"
"So that they may afterward boast of it to their friends, as if they are somehow rendered special by having seen something interesting. In Stanley Preston's case, it was as if he felt his stature was enhanced by the possession of relics of important figures from the past."
"He was impressed by wealth and power."
"I would say there are few in our society who are not. Wouldn't you?"
"I suspect you are right."
He let his gaze drift again around that fashionable, expensively furnished drawing-room.
"Tell me, does your brother's opinion of Stanley Preston match your own?"
"Oh, Henry is far more charitable than I when it comes to the foibles and vanities of his fellow men. He really should have been a vicar, you know, rather than a banker."
"So why did he quarrel with Preston at the Monster last night?"
She jerked ever so slightly, her thread snarling beneath her hands. He said,
"You do know, don't you?"
It was more of a statement than a question. She rested the embroidery frame on her lap, her hands idle, her gaze meeting his. "It's a difficult subject to speak of, I'm afraid."
"Why's that?"
It involves Anne."
"Yet it will come out eventually, whatever it is."
Miss Austen drew a troubled breath and nodded, obviously choosing her words with care. "Some years ago, when Anne was just 17, she formed an attachment to a certain hussar cornet. The man himself was also quite young, only a year or so older, I believe, and utterly penniless."
"But very dashing in his regimentals."
"Devastatingly so, I'm afraid."
"Her father objected to the match."
"What father would not? She was so very young. Even my cousin Eliza agreed that to allow a girl to attach herself at such a young age to a man with nothing but himself to recommend him would be folly."
"So what happened?"
"The young man's suit was denied. Fortunately for all concerned, his regiment was sent abroad not long afterward, and that was the end of it, or so everyone supposed. It was assumed by all who knew her that Anne had forgotten him. Indeed, she lately seemed to be on the verge of contracting a promising alliance. But then, a month or so ago, the young man reappeared in London. A captain now, but still virtually penniless, I'm afraid."
"He's sold out?"
"Oh, no. He was badly wounded in the peninsula, and has been sent home to recuperate further."
"I take it Mr. Preston was still not inclined to favour such a match?"
She shook her head. If anything, I'd say he was more opposed to it than ever before.
And Miss Anne Preston?
Jane Austen began to pick at her snarled thread. I'm afraid I can't speak for another woman's heart. Sebastian studied her carefully bowed head.
I still don't precisely understand how your brother came to fall into a quarrel with Preston last night.
Miss Austen kept her attention on her work. Now that Eliza's illness has confined her to her rooms, Anne comes nearly every day to sit and read to her, or when my cousin feels up to it, simply to talk. It was during one of Anne's recent visits that Eliza confided that she'd decided she made a mistake 6 years ago in counselling Stanley Preston to refuse the young man's offer, and that she regrets having played a part in denying Anne the happiness she might otherwise have found with someone she loved.
I take it Anne was unwise enough to repeat her friend's words to her father.
Yes, and since he couldn't confront poor Eliza about it, he shouted at Henry instead.
Sebastian thought he understood now why Jane Austen had mentioned Stanley Preston's quarrelsome tendency as one of his less admirable traits. What is the name of this unsuitable young man?
Wyeth. Captain Hugh Wyeth.
And where might I find Captain Wyeth?
I believe he has taken a room in the vicinity of the lifeguards' barracks, but I'm afraid I can't give you his precise direction.
Do you know his regiment?
No, I'm sorry.
Thank you, said Sebastian, pushing to his feet. You've been very helpful.
Perhaps my brother will be able to tell you more when he returns to town, she said, rising with him, her expression one of earnest concern.
Hopefully, said Sebastian, although when he looked into those dark, intelligent eyes, he couldn't shake the conviction that this self-contained, quietly watchful woman actually knew considerably more than she'd been willing to divulge. Sebastian spent the better part of the next hour making inquiries about Captain Hugh Wyeth at the various inns and taverns in the lanes and courts around the lifeguards' barracks in Knightsbridge. But when the bells of the city's church towers began to chime 6, he abandoned the search and turned his horses toward home.
"You thinking this Hussar captain might be the one done for the cove at Bloody Bridge?" asked Tom, as they rounded the corner onto Brook Street.
"I'd say he's certainly a likely suspect."
The heavy cloud cover had already robbed most of the light from the day, so that the reflected glow of the newly lit street lamps spilled like liquid gold across the dark, wet pavement. Sebastian guided his horses around a dowager's cabriole drawn up at the front steps of a nearby townhouse. And then, for reasons he could not have explained, he was suddenly intensely aware of the solid length of the leather reins running through his hands, of the throbbing of the sparrows coming in to roost on the housetops above, and the scattered drops of cold rain blown by a gust of wind against his face as he lifted his head to study the jagged line of roofs looming above them.
"What?" asked Tom, watching him.
"Something doesn't feel right," he said, reining in hard, just as an unseen force knocked the top hat from his head, and a rifle shot cracked from somewhere in the gathering gloom. Chapter 12. "Get down!" Sebastian shouted at Tom.
"Holy hell!"
yelped the tiger, tumbling from his perch as Sebastian fought to bring the squealing, plunging pair under control. Then, rather than duck for cover down the nearest area steps, the boy leapt to the frantic horses' heads.
"God damn it!"
swore Sebastian.
"Are you trying to get yourself shot? Get out of here!"
"Easy, lads, easy," crooned the tiger.
The whirl of a watchman's rattle sounded over the horses' frightened snorts and pounding hooves.
I say, blustered an aging, fleshy man in a bulky greatcoat as he trotted up, his lantern swaying wildly, one arm thrust straight above his head as he spun his wooden rattle furiously round and round.
"Was that a shot?"
"That was a shot, yes."
"That was a shot," said Sebastian.
More people were spilling into the street. slack-faced butlers and elegant gentlemen in tails, and one grimly determined footman brandishing a blunderbuss. "Merciful heavens," said the watchman, swallowing hard. "Whoever heard of such a thing? In Brook Street, of all places. Where did it come from?" He turned in a slow circle with his lantern held high, as if its feeble light might somehow illuminate the would-be assassin. Sebastian finally brought his frightened horses to a stand. "It came from the roof of that row of houses, but I suspect the shooter is long gone by now." "Look at this," said a skinny youth in silken breeches as he held up Sebastian's beaver hat with one white-gloved finger thrust through a neat hole in the crown. "That was close." "Holy hell," whispered Tom again, his hand sliding slowly down the nearest horse's quivering hide. Sebastian could hear Simon's colicky wails even before he reached number 41 Brook Street. "At it again, is he?" said Sebastian, handing Maury his hat and driving coat. A harassed expression drifted across the major-domo's normally carefully controlled countenance. At close range the child's screams were painful. "I'm afraid so, my lord." He laid the driving coat over one arm, then froze when he got a better look at the elegant, high-crowned beaver hat in his hands. "Is that a bullet hole, my lord?" Sebastian yanked off his driving gloves. "It is. And it was a new hat, too. Calhoun is going to be devastated." He glanced up as another howl drifted down from above. "How long has he been at it?" "A good while, I'm afraid. He started early this evening." "Well, at least we know there's nothing wrong with his lungs," said Sebastian, taking the stairs to the nursery 2 at a time. He was halfway to the 3rd floor when he met Claire Bisset on her way down to make a fresh bottle of sweetened dill and fennel water. Hero might have refused to employ a wet nurse, but she'd welcomed Claire into their household with relief. An impoverished French émigrée in her early 30s, Claire was both older and considerably better educated than the young, ignorant country girls who typically served as nursemaids. "What set him off?" he asked Claire. She paused to push a stray lock of light brown hair out of her face with the back of one delicate wrist. "Who knows? Believe it or not, he's better now than he was." Climbing to the top of the stairs, Sebastian found Hero walking back and forth before the nursery fire, the child's rigid body held so that her shoulder pressed against his stomach, his little fists clenched tight, his face red and distorted with his howls. At the sound of Sebastian's step, she turned, her quietly exasperated gaze meeting his. "Here," said Sebastian, and walked forward to take his screaming son into his arms. "I showed the section of inscribed lead to my father," Hero said some time later in a quiet moment, when Simon dozed fitfully against her. Sebastian had settled on the hearthrug beside her, his back propped against the side of her chair, a glass of wine in one hand. "And?" he asked, looking up at her. "He says the tomb of Charles I was discovered just last week in St. George's in Windsor Castle, when the workmen, constructing a new passage to the royal vault, accidentally stumbled upon it. Needless to say, he was not at all pleased by the possibility that someone might have made off with the royal coffin strap." Sebastian took a slow sip of his wine. "Interesting, especially when you consider that Stanley Preston was an avid collector with a special interest in items from the Tudor and Stuart periods. He even has Oliver Cromwell's head." "His actual head?" "The actual head, along with those of Henri IV and the Duke of Suffolk." "How ghoulish! Not to mention suggestive, given how Preston died." She cautiously readjusted the sleeping child's weight. "What manner of man was he?" "Preston? Proud, socially ambitious, quarrelsome. Although, according to a rather interesting spinster I met, he was also a devout and devoted family man. The sort, she says, one could like, in spite of himself. "If one could overlook the fact that he owned hundreds of slaves," said Hero.
"Yes, but it never ceases to amaze me the number of otherwise decent members of our society who can overlook it without any difficulty at all. I suppose it's because the institution is both legal and biblical, not to mention highly profitable, so it never occurs to most people to question the custom any further." He realized she was staring at him with an oddly intent, unreadable gaze.
"What is it you're not telling me?" she said. He paused in the act of raising his wineglass to his lips.
"What do you mean?"
"There's a trickle of dried blood on your left temple."
"There is?"
He pushed to his feet and went to inspect his forehead in the mirror over the washstand.
"So there is. That shot obviously came closer than I realized."
"Someone shot at you? Tonight?" He wet a cloth and dabbed at the cut.
"Just as I was turning onto Brook Street. They must have been lying in wait for me."
"And it didn't occur to you to mention it to me?"
"They missed."
"No, they didn't." He dabbed at the dried blood again, his gaze still on his reflection in the mirror.
"I've obviously stirred someone up. The problem is I haven't the slightest notion whom. The only vaguely possible suspects I've found so far are a hussar captain who's been showing an unwelcome interest in Preston's daughter— unwelcome to Preston, that is— and a banker who publicly quarrelled with Preston the night he died. But the banker is, by all reports, out of town, and I haven't even tracked down the captain yet."
"Someone must see you as a threat," said Hero, her voice oddly tight. "They tried to kill you."
"It could have been meant as a warning."
The babe stirred and let out a soft cry, and Sebastian set aside the blood-stained cloth and turned to reach for the child.
"Here, let me have him for a while."
She hesitated, and he saw something flare in her eyes, something that was there, and then gone, as if quickly hidden away from him. They'd grown so much closer in the months since their marriage, yet he knew she still kept many of her thoughts and feelings from him.
"What?"
he said. "Just be careful, Sebastian. I don't understand what's happening, but whatever it is, it's ugly. Very ugly."
"My dear Lady Devlin,"
he said teasingly, as he eased the now squalling infant from her grasp.
"Are you worried?"
He expected her to answer with one of her typically wry, flippant responses. Instead, she reached up to touch her fingertips to the flesh beside the still raw wound on his forehead and said, "Yes." Chapter 13. The royal residence of Windsor Castle lay in the provincial town of Windsor, some 20 miles to the west of London, on the southern bank of the River Thames. Jarvis had dispatched one of his men that morning with a message warning the Dean to prepare for a visit to the royal vault. But by the time he arrived, the sun had long since slipped below the western walls of the castle. The Honourable and Right Reverend Edward Legg, who served in the prestigious position of Dean of St. George's Chapel, waited in the lower court to meet him, the ancient medieval battlements looming dark against a black sky. A ferociously ambitious cleric, who'd long ago perfected the art of flattering and pleasing those in power, Legg was ponderous and fleshy, with startlingly dark, heavy brows and a weak chin. Now his jowly face showed slick with a nervous sweat, despite the cold wind that whipped at his cassock and sent dried leaves scuttling across the castle's wide-sloping lawns. At his side stood the chapel's verger, Rowan Toop, with a horn lantern gripped tightly in one hand. The dean might be in charge of the day-to-day affairs of the chapel, but it was the verger who oversaw the care and maintenance of the venerable old buildings and supervised the burial of the dead. "My lord," said the dean, both men bowing low as a castle guard leapt forward to open the carriage door, "we are truly honoured to—" Jarvis stepped down with an agility surprising for one of his size, and cut off the dean with a curt, "I trust all is ready,"
"Yes, my lord, if I might be so bold as to offer your lordship a nice hot cup of tea, or perhaps a glass of wine before we—" "No."
The Dean bowed again, his habitual bland smile still firmly in place as he held out a hand toward the chapel's ornate western front.
"If you'll come this way, my lord."
They followed the lantern-bearing verger into the medieval church's vast soaring nave, with its ancient stained-glass windows and elaborately carved ceiling and stately alabaster monuments. St. George's was second only to Westminster Abbey as the burial place of kings and queens, princes and princesses, although over the years the precise location of certain royals had become somewhat fuzzy. The entrance to the Prince of Wales's new passage lay in the choir, guarded by a recently installed iron gate wrapped with a heavy padlock and chain.
"Excuse me, my lord,"
said the Dean, producing a large key.
"This will take but a moment."
Jarvis grunted, his gaze drifting over the colourful rows of helms and banners that hung above the intricately carved wooden choir stalls, for the chapel also served as home to the Knights of the Garter.
"As you can see, my lord," said the Dean, as he fumbled with the lock, "we've taken every precaution to ensure that there will be no repeat of the unfortunate scenes that followed the discovery of King Edward's remains."
"I should hope so," said Jarvis. When workmen, repaving the chapel late in the previous century, had accidentally broken into the vault containing the 7-foot coffin of Edward IV, so many gawkers and relic-seekers had managed to find their way into the crypt that they'd carried off much of what was left of Edward, one tooth, lock of hair, and finger-bone at a time, before anyone thought to put a stop to it. The chain rattled as the Dean unwrapped the heavy links, his breath forming a white vapour cloud in the cold. "There," he said, swinging open the gate and stepping back to allow the lantern-bearing verger to precede them. The narrow, nearly complete passage sloped steeply downward, so that they descended rapidly, their footsteps echoing hollowly, the cold air heavy with the smell of dank earth and old death. The small vault that had originally been intended as only a temporary repository for Henry VIII's favourite queen lay roughly halfway between the high altar and the sovereign's garter stall on the western side of the passage. 3 days before, when Jarvis had last visited the crypt, the workmen had expanded their original accidental aperture into an opening large enough to allow him to enter. Now all the rubble from that effort had been cleared away, and a screen discreetly placed before the opening. Jarvis waited, hands clasped behind his back, while the Dean shifted the screen to one side. "Not exactly what you'd expect as the final resting place of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, now, is it?" said the verger, ducking inside with his lamp held before him. The light danced around a crudely constructed vault faced with rough brick, and measuring no more than 7 or 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. The arched ceiling was so low, Jarvis had to stoop considerably as he entered. The 3 coffins lay precisely as they had when he'd last seen them, with Henry VIII's bones and bits of cloth showing quite clearly amidst the decayed wood and warped lead of his shattered casket. Beside him, Jane Seymour's better-preserved casket rested at an odd angle against the far wall, as if it had been hastily shoved aside by frightened men working stealthily to bury a murdered king. The coffin of the unlucky Charles I lay to the left of his predecessors, still covered with the original black velvet pall which had been carefully replaced after Jarvis's last visit. The Dean said, "As you can see, my lord, nothing has been disturbed." "Remove the pall," said Jarvis. The Dean's smile of gentle complacence faltered. "My lord?" "You heard me." The Dean nodded to the verger, who glanced around helplessly for some place to set his lantern. "Here, give it to me," snapped the Dean, taking the lantern from the man's grasp. The verger swiped the palms of both hands down the sides of his cassock, as if reluctant to touch the dusty, threadbare old cloth before them. He was a skinny man, well into his 30s, with straight, straw-coloured hair and a long, bony face dominated by a protuberant mouth full of large, crooked teeth. Unlike the Dean, who was the 7th son of an earl, and probably destined for a bishopric, the verger was a layman of far more ordinary origins. Moving slowly, he carefully folded back the pall to reveal Charles I's lead coffin, white and chalky with age. On his last visit to the vault, Jarvis had left strict instructions that the coffin was not to be touched. Its lid was to remain soldered tight, and the leaden scroll that encircled it kept in place to await the prince's formal examination. Now the scroll gaped open, its cut edges showing clearly where the section bearing the inscription King Charles, 1648, had been removed. But rather than tackle the solder, the thieves had simply cut a large square opening in the upper part of the lid. Easy enough to do, since the outer lead coffin was only a thin sheet, and its wooden lining much decayed. "Give me the lantern," said Jarvis. The Dean stood frozen, eyes wide, jaw slack with horror. "Hand it to me, damn you!" The Dean gave a start and held it out to him. Jarvis raised the lantern high so that the golden light played over the coffin's interior. An unctuous, foul-smelling matter glistened from the cerecloth where it had been pulled back to reveal a large, bowl-like depression of the size and shape of a head. But only a few darkened wisps of hair now clung to the stained, waxy shroud. The torso ended abruptly at the neck. "Merciful heavens," said the Dean, one hand cupped over his nose and mouth. "Someone's stolen the king's head." Chapter 14. Tuesday, 23rd of March. Hero cradled her infant son in her arms and watched in the glow from the fire as his tiny fist opened and closed against her bare skin. She discovered a rare peace in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still sleeps, and the only sounds are the whispered fall of ash on the hearth, and the soft suckling of a babe at his mother's breast. Smiling, she breathed in the child's sweet scent, and let the quiet joy of the moment flow through her. She was still awed by the ability of her body to supply him with nourishment, and had become fiercely protective of this time they shared. Her determination to nurse her own child was not the sacrifice Jarvis envisioned, not a selfless act at all, but something selfish, something that brought her pleasure and a trembling awareness of the powerful depths of her love for both her son and the man who had given him to her. Through all her growing-up years she'd been determined never to marry, determined never to subject herself to the state of subordination to which England's laws reduced any woman unwise enough to become a wife. Yet even then she had wanted this, wanted to have a child of her own. The babe looked up, his gaze locking with hers. She smiled at him, and he gave her in return a big toothless grin that sent a trickle of milk running down his chin. And she felt a swift, unexpected sting of tears in her eyes, for life's greatest joys contain within them a yawning sadness, a bittersweet awareness that even as we savour a cherished instant, it is passing, and will all too soon be but a memory. A hushed murmur drew her gaze to where Devlin slept, his dark head moving restlessly against the pillow. She thought of the bullet that had come so close to taking him from her last night, and her arms tightened around the child's small, warm body. She was not a woman who was accustomed to fear. She'd always despised those who obsessed anxiously about the future. Yet with great love comes great fear, the fear of loss. And in that moment she knew its cold grip. She pushed it away, both ashamed of her weakness and appalled by it. "It's your fault," she whispered to the now contented babe. "You've done this to me." He smiled again, his suckling ceased, his eyes drifting closed. She felt his small body relax against hers, heard his breathing ease into sleep. And still she sat beside the fire, hugging him close and savouring the moment. She left Brook Street an hour later, the clatter of her horse's hooves echoing through the still empty streets of Mayfair as her coachman turned the team toward the city. She'd been told that to truly understand the costermongers of London, she needed to attend one of the great central markets where they purchased their stock. And so she had chosen to visit the grandest market of them all, Covent Garden. The rising sun was just beginning to send streaks of gold and fiery orange across a pale sky when she reached the site of the city's largest produce and flower market. Yet already the vast square before the old temple-like church of St. Paul's was thronged with a shouting, shoving, laughing crowd that surged around stalls piled high with everything from mud-encrusted onions and potatoes to bundles of white leeks and dark purple pickling cabbages. She had hired a skinny 14-year-old boy named Lucky Liam Gordon to serve as her guide to the wonders of the market. He had a thatch of rusty brown hair and a scattering of freckles across a pug nose, and he was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of costermongers. Hero was only just beginning to understand how closely knit and hereditary the trade was. She had hired a skinny 14-year-old named Lucky Liam Gordon, nodding to the lines of empty covered wagons and carts pulling away from the square.
They start rolling in from the farms about 3. I heard tell they load 'em at sunset, then leave for the city anywhere between 10 and 1, depending on how far they've got to come.
He had to shout to be heard over the roar of hundreds of haggling voices, the cracking of whips and the braying of donkeys, and the rattle of iron-rimmed wheels bouncing over uneven paving stones. Hero let her gaze drift over the crush of gaily painted hand-barrows, the rows of donkey carts with cracked harnesses so old they were often held together with wire or rope. The crisp morning air was heavy with the sense of charcoal smoke and dung and earthy vegetables, the pungent aromas from the herb stalls mingling with the sweet fragrance of potted laurels and myrtles and boxes. She smiled at the sight of 2 little boys chasing each other across cobbles smeared green with discarded leaves. Then one of the boys slipped and nearly collided with a market woman staggering beneath a heavy basket balanced on her head before careening into Hero. "Careful," said Hero, keeping a strong grip on her reticule as she steadied the boy. He threw her a cocky grin and darted off again. The number of young children at the market, most of them boys, surprised her. Shrieks rose from a clutch of children washing at the pump, while more could be seen crowding around the fires of the coffee and tea stalls beneath the arcades, or congregating near the narrow lanes leading out of the square. Some looked no older than 4 or 5. "Why are they queuing?" asked Hero, watching the boys push and shove as they lined up.
"They're hoping some costermonger without a boy of his own will hire 'em for the day," said Lucky. "Some has parents what send 'em here to look for work, but a good many of 'em are orphans. They sleeps under the stalls at night and eats mainly specks."
Hero brought her gaze back to his freckled face. "They eat what?"
"Specks. That's what we call anything that's overripe or shrivelled, or that the wasps have been at. They're set aside, you see, then sold for a quarter the price of the rest. Me da always says if something won't fetch a good price, then it must fetch a bad one."
Hero drew her notebook and pencil from her reticule and began scribbling notes. Officially, Covent Garden Market was devoted to the sale of fruits, vegetables, and flowers, but she could also see old iron cellars and crockery stalls scattered amidst the produce, as well as countrymen peddling wild ducks and rabbits. Rows of baskets and slippers dangled against the railings of St. Paul's churchyard, while men and women with rusty trays slung from straps around their necks pushed their way through the crowd, hawking seed cakes and sweetmeats, razors and knives, ribbons and combs. She was watching a lark at the birdcatcher's stall beat its wings against the bars of its cage when Lucky said,
"You know that fella?"
"Who?" asked Hero, her gaze scanning the surging, raucous mass of humanity.
"That queer-looking cove up there by the Piazza Hotel, the one with the fancy black boots. He's been staring at you ever so long. At first I thought maybe he was just puzzling over what such a bang-up lady's doing at Covent Garden Market, but he ain't no coster, and he ain't no grower neither, from the looks of him. So, what's he doing here?"
Hero could see him now, a slope-shouldered man of medium height, lanky except for a small, slightly protuberant belly. He had a slouch hat tipped back on his head, and was leaning against one of the granite pillars of the elevated North Piazza, a tin cup from a nearby coffee stall cradled in one hand, the other resting negligently in his pocket. "How do you know he's not a costermonger?" she asked. Lucky laughed. "I know." The man took a slow sip of his coffee. He wore neither the blue apron of the greengrocer's nor the straw hat, smock frock, and dusty shoes of the countryman, although his coat and breeches had never been of particularly good quality, and were now worn and rumpled and greasy. Only his well-polished, high-topped boots struck a discordant note. For one long, intense moment, the man's gaze met hers across the square, and Hero felt her mouth go dry and an unpleasant sensation crawl across her skin. He had an oddly uneven face, with a full-lipped, crooked mouth, and one eye that seemed slightly larger than the other. The sun was just cresting the rooftops of the decrepit 17th-century houses that lined the square, and spilling golden light across the ragged, raucous crowd. The slanting sunlight caught the smoke from the charcoal fires, so that for one eerie moment the air took on a hellish glow. Then the sun inched higher, and the illusion was broken. "How long has he been watching us?" she asked Lucky. To her knowledge, she had never seen the man before and couldn't imagine who he might be. "I can't say for sure," said Lucky, "but I noticed him right after we got here." She studied the unknown man's strange profile. He was perhaps 35 or more years of age, his straight black hair worn long enough to hang over his collar, and a 2 or 3 days' growth of beard shadowed his face. He kept his head deliberately turned away, but she had no doubt that he was still aware of her, that she was the reason he was here now. "If I didn't know better, I'd think he followed you here," said Lucky. "Only, why would some fella be following you?" "I don't know," said Hero, shoving her notebook and pencil back into her reticule, "but I intend to ask him." Gathering her carriage gown in both fists to lift the hem clear of the muck-strewn paving stones, Hero strode across the square, weaving around weathered, half-rotten stalls, and ploughing determinedly through the throngs of earnestly haggling purchasers and sellers. She had almost reached the step up to the piazza when the black-booted man pushed away from the pillar and melted into the crowd. She tried to follow him, shoving past sieves piled high with apples, and a thick mass of gawkers gathered around what looked like an upside-down umbrella filled with ribald prints. But by the time she reached the corner of James Street, he had disappeared. She stared over the noisy sea of donkeys and barrows and ragged men and women clogging the lane. "Blast!" she whispered beneath her breath. "Who was he?" asked Lucky as he caught up with her. But Hero only shook her head, conscious of an unpleasant tingling in her fingertips, and a sensation of disquiet that would not be stilled. Chapter 15. Sebastian was sitting down to a solitary breakfast after a hard ride in the park when he heard the distant peal of the front bell, followed by a young woman's voice in the hall. "Miss Anne Preston to see you, my lord," said Maury, appearing in the doorway. "She says it's urgent." "Please show her in." Stanley Preston's daughter came in with a quick step and a determined, almost fierce expression that faded to chagrin as she drew up just inside the doorway. "I've interrupted your breakfast. I do beg your pardon. I'll go." He pushed to his feet. "No, please, come in and sit down. May I offer you some tea? Toast, perhaps?" "Nothing, thank you." She took the seat he indicated, both hands gripping her reticule in her lap as she leaned forward. "I'm sorry for coming so early, but I spoke to Jane Austen last night, and she says she told you about Captain Wyeth. I don't think she realised that when you heard about Father's argument with Mr. Austen, you might leap to some unfortunate conclusions.
Sebastian suspected that Jane Austen had been perfectly aware of the implications of what she told him, but all he said was, "Conclusions about what?"
About Captain Wyeth and Father.
Sebastian reached for his tankard and calmly took a sip of ale, his gaze one of polite interest. When he remained silent, she said in a rush,
"I won't deny that Father was displeased when he learned Captain Wyeth had returned to London, but there was never any confrontation between them. Truly there wasn't."
She looked at him with a pinched, earnest face, as if she could somehow will him to believe her. She was an appallingly bad liar.
Sebastian cut himself a slice of ham.
"Yet your father quarrelled with Mr. Austen over a simple statement of regret voiced by the man's wife from her sickbed."
Father could never abide having his judgments questioned, or being told he was wrong about anything.
"Oh? And what precisely led your friend to change her mind about Captain Wyeth?"
Anne Preston threaded her reticule strings between her fingers. "When she opposed the match between Hugh and me 6 years ago, Eliza was very much governed by material considerations. She thought at the time she had my best interests at heart, but—"
"Yes?"
prompted Sebastian. "She says her illness has altered her perception, that she now sincerely regrets the part she once played in helping to deprive me of the happiness I could have enjoyed all these years."
"Your father found that objectionable?"
"Father always hoped to see us, that is, my brother and me, marry well. It was extraordinarily important to him."
"So Captain Wyeth has renewed his quest for your hand?"
"Oh, no. No. We've only met a few times since his return to London. As old acquaintances. Nothing more."
Sebastian noted the telltale stain of colour on her cheeks, but all he said was, "I understand Captain Wyeth has taken a room in Knightsbridge. Where precisely?"
She stared at him. "But I've just explained. There is no reason to involve him in any way."
"Nevertheless, I would like to speak with him." He watched her nostrils flare in panic as she realized her bold attempt to shield the captain from suspicion had failed utterly. She dropped her gaze to her clenched hands and said quietly, "He's at the Shepherd's Rest, in middle row." "Thank you," said Sebastian. She fiddled again with the strings of her reticule.
"You asked yesterday if there was anyone with whom Father had quarrelled recently."
"Yes."
"I've been giving your question some thought, and it occurs to me that there is someone. I don't know if you could say Father quarrelled with him precisely, but Father was definitely afraid of him. His name is Oliphant, Sinclair Oliphant."
In the silence that followed her words, Sebastian could hear himself breathing, feel the slow and steady beat of his own pulse. He cleared his throat and somehow managed to say, "You mean Colonel Sinclair Oliphant?"
"Yes, although he's Lord Oliphant now. He inherited his brother's title and estates, you know."
"Yes, I did know. Although it was my understanding he'd been posted as Governor of Jamaica."
"He was, yes. But he recently surrendered his position and returned to England. He's taken a townhouse in Mount Street for the season."
Sebastian reached for his ale and wrapped both hands around the tankard. 3 years before, in the mountains of Portugal, Sinclair Oliphant had deliberately betrayed Sebastian to a French major known for his inventive and painful ways of inflicting death. Sebastian had survived, but what the French major had done after that would haunt Sebastian for the rest of his life. He took a long, slow swallow of the ale, then set the tankard aside with a hand that was not quite steady. "Why was your father afraid of Oliphant?"
"I don't know exactly. I mean, I know Father was furious with Oliphant's behaviour as governor. In fact, Father went out there last year precisely to try to do something about him."
"Your father was in Jamaica last year?"
"Yes."
"Did you go with him?"
"Oh, no. I stayed with the Austins. I've never actually been to Jamaica at all. Father always said it wasn't a healthy place for a woman."
"It isn't a healthy place for anyone."
He studied her smooth, seemingly guileless young face. He wanted to ask if it bothered her to know that the clothes on her back, like the pearl drops in her ears, and the food she ate every day were paid for by the labour of enslaved men, women, and children. But all he said was,
"Do you know if your father had anything to do with Oliphant's decision to return to England?"
"No. Father never discussed such things with me. But last Friday he was out for several hours in the afternoon, and when he returned home he looked positively stricken. I asked what was wrong, and he said that he was afraid he'd made a mistake, that Oliphant is far more dangerous than he'd realized."
"Your father was right. Oliphant is dangerous. Very dangerous."
Something in his voice must have given him away, for she looked at him strangely, her lips parting, a faint frown line creasing her forehead. "You know him?"
"I did. Once,"
said Sebastian, and left it at that. After she had gone, he went to stand before the long windows overlooking the terrace and the gardens below. The neatly edged parterres showed a vibrant green in the fitful sunshine, the newly turned earth a warm brown. But he saw only ancient stone walls burned black, and a child's doll lost in a drift of orange blossoms. There are moments in the course of a man's life that can irrevocably alter its path and sear his soul forever. Sebastian had encountered such a pivotal moment one cold spring in the mountains of Portugal, when he had obeyed the orders of a colonel he knew to be both vicious and deceitful, and dozens of innocent women and children had paid with their lives for his gullibility. Another man might have sought refuge in a string of excuses. "I didn't know. I was simply obeying orders. I was too late to save them." But not Sebastian. Their spilled blood had irrevocably coloured his sense of who and what he was. Once he had sworn to avenge their deaths, sworn to kill Oliphant, even if it meant he had to die for it himself. But with time, he had come to realize that the drive for vengeance was his own, that it was his own pain he sought to ease, his own guilt he hoped to redeem. Those gentle religious women who had dedicated their lives to the care of others and died because of it would have prayed for Sinclair Oliphant's salvation, not for his death. Sebastian would not violate their memory by killing in their name. But there was a difference between vengeance and justice, and he was determined that the innocents of Santa Iria would have justice, one way or another. The elegant house on Mount Street, so recently hired by Sinclair Oliphant for his gently bred wife and their 5 children, rose 5 stories tall, its shiny black door flanked by polished brass lanterns, its marble front steps freshly scrubbed. Sebastian stood for a time on the footpath, his gaze on that stately facade, his thoughts on the man he'd last seen in a rough campaign tent in the mountains of Portugal. Colonial governorships were coveted, lucrative positions seldom surrendered voluntarily. If Stanley Preston was, in fact, behind Oliphant's sudden, unexpected return to London, then Preston had made himself a dangerous enemy indeed. Still thoughtful, Sebastian mounted the house's front steps. His knock was answered by a sombre butler who provided the information that his lordship was breakfasting that morning at White's. But Sebastian had to trail Oliphant from the clubs of St. James's through several exclusive shops in Bond Street before he finally came upon his former colonel at Manton's shooting gallery in Davies Street. Leaning against a nearby wall, Sebastian crossed his arms at his chest and waited while Oliphant methodically culped wafers with one of Manton's sleek new flintlock pistols. The man looked much as Sebastian remembered him. In his mid-40s now, he was trim, broad-shouldered, and tall, with the erect carriage typical of a career military officer. His jaw was strong and square, his cheeks lean, his lips habitually curled into a smile that hid a capacity for self-interest that was brutal in its intensity. Sebastian had no doubt that Oliphant was aware of his presence, but the colonel simply went on, calmly hitting the rows of paper targets attached to an iron frame at the far end of the long, narrow room. After each shot he paused, reloaded his pistol, and fired again, the acrid smoke billowing around them until the last wafer went down. Only then did he turn to face Sebastian, his movements graceful and untroubled, almost bored. It was the first time Sebastian had seen the colonel since he'd sent Sebastian on a mission deliberately calculated to end in so much innocent death. Now Sebastian searched the man's clear blue eyes for some sign of guilt or regret, or even discomfort. But he saw only the familiar self-satisfaction edged faintly with contempt. And he knew then that the events of that faraway spring, the deaths that had shattered Sebastian's soul and marked him for life, had troubled the man who caused them not at all. Sebastian felt a powerful surge of rage pulse through him. He wanted to smash his fist into that complacently smiling face. He wanted to feel flesh split and bone shatter beneath his driving knuckles. He wanted to wrap his hands around the man's throat and crush it until he saw the life ebb from those hated eyes. And he had to clench his hands at his sides and force himself to take a deep, steadying breath before he could bring the surging bloodlust under control. "I didn't realize shooting had become a spectator sport," said Oliphant, calmly passing the pistol to a waiting attendant. Sebastian held himself very still, practicing in case someone should challenge you to a duel. Oliphant's smile never slipped. "I like to keep my hand in." He stripped off the leather sleeves he wore to protect his starched white cuffs and went to wash his hands at the basin. "You're not here to shoot?" "Not today." Sebastian watched him splash warm water over his face and reach for the towel. "How long have you been back from Jamaica?" "Not long," said Oliphant, his attention seemingly all for the task of drying his hands. "I understand you knew a man named Preston, Stanley Preston." Oliphant glanced over at him. "As it happens, I did. Why do you ask?" "Someone cut off his head and used it to decorate a bridge near 5 Fields. "So I had heard." "I'm told he was afraid of you." "Why?" "Who told you that?" "Are you saying he wasn't?" Oliphant tossed the towel at the washstand and turned away to ease his coat up over his shoulders with the attendant's help. "Some people frighten easily." He adjusted his cuffs. "They say you came down from the hills in Portugal swearing to kill me on sight." He pivoted to face Sebastian, his arms spread wide, his eyebrows lifted as if in inquiry or challenge. "Change your mind?" "Not exactly." The man's handsome smile slipped ever so slightly, then broadened. "What do you have in mind? Pistols at dawn? Or a knife wielded in darkness from a fetid alley?" Sebastian shook his head. 3 years ago, an innocent Portuguese nun was raped and tortured to death because of you, while 32 children and the simple, pious women who cared for them were put to the sword or burned alive. No English court will ever convict you for what you did to the convent of Santa Iria. But if you murdered Stanley Preston, I'm going to personally watch you hang for it." Then he turned and strode from the room, before the urge to kill the man with his bare hands overwhelmed him. Chapter 16. Hero arrived home from her early expedition to Covent Garden to find Devlin seated at his desk, fitting a new flint into his small double-barreled pistol. "The strangest thing happened at the market this morning," she said, yanking off her yellow kid gloves as she walked into the library. "There was this man—" She broke off as Devlin looked up, and she saw his face. The room was filled with shadows, for the day had grown overcast, and he had no need to kindle a candle to light his work. Yet even in the gloom she could sense the taut, hard set of his features, see the lethal gleam and the strange yellow luminosity of his eyes. "What is it?" she said.
"Sinclair Oliphant is in London."
She was suddenly acutely aware of the ticking of the mantel clock, of the lean strength of his fingers as he worked on the gun. He had told her of some of the events of that blood-soaked Portuguese spring. She knew of Oliphant's betrayal and the hideous carnage that flowed from it. But she'd always suspected that Devlin hadn't told her everything, that he was holding back some crucial component of the events of that day. And that was what he had quietly to himself, was the part that most lacerated his soul and drove him on a path to destruction. She set aside her gloves. "You've seen him?" He nodded.
"Anne Preston came to me this morning. I think her main purpose was to try to convince me of Captain Wyeth's innocence, but she also told me her father was afraid of Oliphant. It seems Preston objected to Oliphant's actions as governor of Jamaica, and I wouldn't be surprised if he used his influence with his cousin, the Home Secretary, to have Oliphant recalled."
"You're suggesting Oliphant might have hacked off Preston's head and set it up on Bloody Bridge in revenge?"
"Personally? Probably not, since Oliphant has always preferred to let other people do his dirty work."
She watched him square the flint to the frizzen and begin to tighten down. He was a man comfortable with violence, willing to use it when necessary, and perhaps sometimes even welcoming it. But she didn't believe he would take it upon himself to simply execute Oliphant, as he might have once done. Then she wondered if he sensed the drift of her thoughts, because he said,
"I'm not going to kill him out of hand and hang for it, if that's what you're worried about. But I wouldn't be surprised if he has already tried to have me killed."
She stared at him. "You think he was behind last night's shooter? But you didn't even know about his involvement with Preston until this morning." Devlin closed the frizzen and brought the flint gently down on it.
"If Oliphant sent that shooter, it was because of Santa Eria, not because of Preston. As soon as Oliphant made the decision to return to London, he knew he was going to need to deal with me. And the people Oliphant deals with generally end up dead."
"Then perhaps you should kill him," she said, "as long as you can be certain you won't hang for it, of course." His eyes crinkled with amusement, for he thought she spoke in jest. Except that she hadn't. She loved him with a fierceness that could steal her breath and freeze her heart with the fear of losing him. But while she admired Devlin's moral code, she didn't completely share it. In many ways, she was still very much her father's daughter. He slipped the pistol into his pocket and rose to his feet.
"If Oliphant was behind Stanley Preston's murder, I'm going to see him hang for it."
"And if he didn't have Preston murdered?" Devlin smiled again, this time with lethal purposefulness.
"Then I'll kill him. When he comes to kill me."
Chapter 17. Half an hour later, Sebastian was walking out of the house toward his waiting curricle when a stylish barouche, drawn by a team of blood bays and emblazoned with the Jarvis crest, rounded the corner and drew up close to the curb. The carriage's near window came down with a snap.
"Ride with me around the block,"
said Jarvis, as one of his liveried footmen rushed to open the carriage door. Sebastian paused at the base of the house steps.
"Why? Do you seriously expect me to discuss it in the street?"
Sebastian exchanged looks with Tom, who was standing nearby at the chestnuts' heads. Then he leapt up into Jarvis's carriage and took the forward bench.
"What you are about to hear is told in the strictest confidence,"
said Jarvis, as his team moved forward with a jerk. Sebastian studied his father-in-law's full, complacent face.
"Sent one of your minions out to Windsor Castle, did you?
The other man's eyes glittered with an animosity he made no attempt to disguise.
As it happens, I went myself. And? Charles I's burial vault has been violated. The inscribed section of the lead band that once encircled the coffin has been removed, as has the king's head. The head?
Sebastian stared at him, his attention well and truly caught.
Was anything else taken from the crypt? That has not yet been determined, although I have instructed the dean and his verger to make a thorough investigation. Did you open Charles's coffin when you first inspected the vault for the Prince Regent? I did not.
The carriage swung onto Bond Street, and Jarvis reached up to grasp the strap that dangled beside him.
It is the Prince's wish that he be present at the coffin's opening, with the contents to be inspected not only by himself, but by a number of other important individuals. So, if you never actually opened the coffin before, how can you be certain the head was ever there? King Charles might have been buried without it. The depression where the head once rested within the folds of the cerecloth is quite obvious, apart from which all the accounts we have of the events that occurred immediately after the execution state quite clearly that Charles's head was sewn back onto the body before the dead king's remains were put on display.
Was he put on display?
Of course he was. It would have been vitally important to the usurpers that the populace be convinced that their king was indeed dead.
Sebastian stared thoughtfully out the window at a costermonger with a gaily painted donkey cart, the boy beside him shouting, "Turnips! Penny a bunch!"
The Princess Augusta is not expected to live out the day, Jarvis was saying. Her funeral will doubtless take place sometime next week, and the regent is determined to hold the formal opening of Charles's tomb immediately thereafter.
Sebastian brought his gaze back to his father-in-law's face.
I take it no one has told His Highness that someone already beat him to it. No wonder you didn't want to discuss this in the street.
Jarvis tightened his grip on the strap.
It's conceivable the theft has political implications. Was Stanley Preston an admirer of the Stuarts? The Stuarts certainly interested him, but I don't know if you could say he admired them. You're certain? No. At this point, I'm not certain of anything. And you've learned nothing that might suggest who was behind the violation of the royal vault?
Sebastian found himself faintly smiling. No. Jarvis studied him through hard, narrowed eyes.
You find my question amusing? Amusing? Not exactly. 2 days ago, a man was murdered in a particularly brutal fashion by someone who is still out there walking our streets. Yet your only concern in all this is how it might lead to the recovery of some mouldering old head? It is not simply some random mouldering old head we're talking about, snapped Jarvis in a rare show of irritation. And as for whatever fears have been aroused amongst the populace by the grisly manner of this murder, they will be easy enough to assuage with a swift public hanging. Whether the hanged man is actually guilty of the murder or not. Fortunately, we don't all share your maudlin obsession with guilt and innocence.
Sebastian met his father-in-law's hard, ruthless gaze, and wondered why it had never occurred to him just how much Jarvis and Oliphant had in common. The carriage swung back onto Brook Street, and Jarvis signalled his coachman to pull up. I want that head. If I should happen to come across it, I'll see it returned to you. Sebastian opened the door without waiting for the footman. Then he paused on the step to look back and say, What do you know of Sinclair, Lord Oliphant?
The man who was until recently governor of Jamaica?
Jarvis frowned.
Very little. Why? Colonial governors are appointed by the Crown, are they not? Officially, but they're handled by the Home Office. That's what I thought, said Sebastian, stepping down. Jarvis leaned forward, his hand coming up to stay the footman, who had moved to close the door. I don't like Hero's involvement in this affair. It's too dangerous." "Hero lives her own life as she sees fit, as well you know." Something flared in the powerful man's eyes. "If anything should happen to either my daughter or my grandson because of this ridiculous obsession of yours, you won't live long enough to mourn them." Then he settled back, turned his face away, and signalled his coachman to drive on. Sebastian drove his curricle to the Home Office, where he learned from a helpful clerk that Lord Sidmouth was in Downing Street and would surely be closeted with the Prime Minister for the rest of the day on a matter of supreme urgency that the clerk refused to particularise. "Think he's avoiding you?" asked Tom when Sebastian took the reins again, then paused to stare thoughtfully toward the river. "Perhaps, but perhaps not." The discovery that an undetermined number of royal relics, including the head of King Charles I, were missing from the chapel at Windsor Castle had added a bizarre new twist to the murder of Stanley Preston. It seemed probable that whoever stole the relics did so with the intent of selling them to Preston, either directly or, more likely, through some unknown middleman. Could that explain Preston's presence at the bridge on such a cold, wet night? Was he there to take possession of the stolen relics? The problem with that theory was that such items were typically delivered to their wealthy purchasers' doorsteps discreetly hidden inside straw-filled tea chests, not handed over under cloak of darkness at the end of a deserted lane. Yet the presence of Charles I's coffin strap at the murder scene suggested an undeniable link. Had the relics been dangled before Preston as clever bait to lure him to some out-of-the-way spot where he could be murdered? Why was the engraved strap left at the scene? Deliberately? Or by accident? And where was the king's purloined head? Still pondering these questions and more, Sebastian turned his horses toward Knightsbridge and a ramshackle hostelry called the Shepherd's Rest. Chapter 18. Captain Hugh Wyeth was playing solitaire at a table in the crowded tap-room, a half-empty tankard of ale at his elbow, a deck of cards held in his left hand, his right arm resting in a sling. He looked up when Sebastian approached his table, his gaze assessing, guarded. "You're Devlin?" he asked. "Yes." Wyeth set his deck of cards upside down amidst the ruins of his game. "I've been expecting you." 6 years of war, coupled with the pain of a severe injury and long recovery, had etched lines in the captain's once boyish face. But he was still, as Jane Austen had noted, devastatingly handsome in his regimentals, with black hair and blue eyes and lean, sun-darkened features. His gaze never left Sebastian's. "I didn't kill Stanley Preston." "I imagine it would be rather difficult to cut off a man's head with your arm incapacitated," said Sebastian, nodding to the sling. "So it would, if I were right-handed. As it happens, I am not." "Ah." A group of laughing officers, some on crutches, others looking more hale, crowded into the tap-room. Sebastian said, "Are you capable of walking?" The captain rose to his feet. "Of course. It's mainly my arm that's still not working right, but I hope to be able to rejoin my regiment soon." "Where were you wounded?" Sebastian asked, as they left the inn and cut across Knightsbridge toward the lifeguards' barracks and the park beyond. Wyeth stumbled as he stepped off the curb, his lips tightening in a fleeting grimace as he regained his balance. "San Munoz, last fall." "You're certain you're up to walking?" asked Sebastian, watching him. "My leg gets stiff if I sit for too long, that's all." They cut between the officers' stables and the riding school, the tall brick buildings casting cold, dark shadows across the ground. Sebastian said, "I take it Miss Preston warned you to expect me?" "She did, yes. She's terrified I'm going to be blamed for her father's death." "Because Preston objected to your friendship?"
A gleam of self-deprecating amusement showed in the captain's pain-shadowed face.
Oh, I don't think he'd have had too much difficulty with our friendship. It was the prospect of something more serious that he found intolerable.
He watched a troop of new recruits leading their horses from the stables to the riding school, his smile fading as the clatter of shod hooves over cobbles echoed between the crowded buildings.
Look, I understand now just how presumptuous it was of me all those years ago to ask someone as young as Anne was then to share my life, to expect her to follow the drum and face all the hardships and dangers that come with being an army wife. But at the time—"
He hesitated, then shrugged.
"We were both so young, and I was so very proud of my new colours. Proud and utterly blind to how foolish it would have been for a woman with her prospects to throw herself away on a poor vicar's son from the fens of East Anglia." The words were right. Contrite, respectful of conventions, resigned. And yet Sebastian could sense the anger thrumming through the captain's lean, battle-hardened frame. Anger at himself for his lack of major advancement in the army. Anger at the fates for the impoverished birth that was none of his doing. Anger at society for the barriers it had thrown up to keep him from marrying the woman he loved. He hid it well, but the anger was there, deep-seated and powerful. Powerful enough to drive him to cut off a man's head while in the grip of a murderous rage? Perhaps. "Your parents are still there?" asked Sebastian. "In East Anglia?" "No. My mother died not long after I was sent overseas, and my father passed away 6 months ago." "I'm sorry. I've an older sister living here in Knightsbridge. That's why I came to London. She hasn't the room to put me up in her house, but it's good to at least have her nearby." He cast Sebastian a sideways glance. "I didn't come to London expecting to see Anne again, if that's what you're thinking. To be honest, I imagined she must have married someone else years ago. But you did see her. We encountered each other, quite by chance, in Bond Street one morning." He swallowed hard, as if he found it necessary to choke back an upsurge of emotion before he could continue. "I thought I'd managed to forget her. Truly I did. But then I saw her, and it was as if all those years just melted away." Sebastian stared off across the park to where a nursemaid was playing catch with her 2 young charges. He himself had loved passionately and unwisely as a very young man, and come home from war to discover his love for the beautiful, brilliant actress Cat Boleyn still as intense, and still as hopelessly, impossibly wrong in the eyes of society. It was a love that had come close to destroying him. That might well have destroyed him, if it hadn't been for Hero. He said, "How did Preston find out you were in London again?" "Some busybody spied Anne walking with me in the park last week and told him. He confronted Anne, and she confessed the truth, which is that our feelings have not changed." Sebastian watched one of the little boys catch the ball, then tumble over backward, his delighted laughter carrying on the breeze. Captain Wyeth's frank confession gave the lie to what Anne Preston had told him just that morning. Was Wyeth more honest? Sebastian wondered, or simply clever enough to realize that claims of mere friendship were unlikely to be believed. He said, "I take it Preston was no more inclined to favour a match between you now than he was 6 years ago." Wyeth pulled a face. "Hardly. He had high hopes of Anne agreeing to marry some baronet who's been courting her. Anne's grandfather married a rich merchant's daughter, you know, and then Stanley Preston himself improved the family's social standing by marrying the daughter of an impoverished lord. It was his ambition to see Anne marry both a title and money. And he was not a man who liked to have his ambitions thwarted. When did you last see him? Wyeth's gaze slid away, his jaw hardening. Sebastian said, "Recently, I take it." The other man nodded. "Why?" asked Sebastian. Captain Wyeth looked confused. "I don't understand. I mean, why exactly did you see him?" "If you must know, he came barging into the tap room of the Shepherd's Rest last Saturday evening. Threatened to horsewhip me if he ever found out I'd been near his daughter again." "And how did you respond?" "I told him I'm not some slave on one of his plantations, and that if he ever tried it, I'd—" He broke off. "You'd what?" Wyeth let out his breath in an odd expulsion that sounded like a laugh but wasn't. "I said I'd take the whip away and use it on him myself. But I didn't kill him. I swear to God, I didn't kill him." "Where were you Sunday night?" "At a musical evening given by Lady Farningham." "The same event attended by Miss Preston?" "As it happens, yes." "Did Stanley Preston know you were going to be there?" "Good God, no." "So certain?" "Yes. If he'd known, he wouldn't have allowed her to attend." "What time did this musical evening end?" "I couldn't say. I myself left early." "And went where?" "For a walk." "Alone? In the rain?" "Yes, damn you." "You do realize Preston was killed sometime between 10:30 and 11? Wyeth was silent for a moment, his gaze narrowing as he watched a duck come in low to land on the shiny stretch of ornamental water beside them. Then he said again, more quietly this time, "I tell you I didn't kill him." "So who do you think did?" "I don't know." "You think that if I had any idea I wouldn't tell you?" He put up his left hand to massage the shoulder of his wounded arm. "The truth is, Stanley Preston could become damnably abusive when in a passion. He could have tangled with anyone. I know he had a row recently with Thistlewood that nearly ended in blows." "Who?" "Basil Thistlewood, the third. He keeps a cabinet of curiosities down on Cheney Walk in Chelsea. I'm told it's been there forever. His grandfather actually started it." "I've heard of it," said Sebastian. Wyeth nodded. "I remember my sister taking me to see it when I came to visit her one time as a lad." "Do you know why Preston and Thistlewood quarrelled?" "From what I understand, Thistlewood was in a rage over Preston's acquisition of the Duke of Suffolk's head. Claimed it should have been his by rights, only Preston cheated him out of it." "Thistlewood also collects heads?" "He collects anything and everything." Sebastian studied the captain's open, seemingly guileless face. He came across as an essentially pleasant young man, troubled and bitter perhaps, but basically honest and straightforward and unaffected. And yet, Wyeth and Anne Preston had just sent Sebastian in two very different directions, with Miss Preston pointing a subtle finger toward Oliphant, while Wyeth implicated the keeper of a Chelsea cabinet of curiosities. And Sebastian couldn't get past the suspicion that both helpful suggestions were as deliberate as they were coordinated. Chapter 19. There was nothing in London quite like Basil Thistlewood's coffee house, built overlooking the broad waters of the Thames at Chelsea. It had been in existence for nearly a century, with new and exotic items added to its overstuffed rooms every year. Admission was free, for the price of a cup of coffee, or the purchase of a catalogue. "You'd like a catalogue, my lord?" asked Thistlewood, bustling forward as soon as he heard Sebastian talking to the barman. "Twopence each, 3 for 5 pence, and a tanner will get you a personal guided tour." The coffee-house owner was a wiry, gaunt-faced man, probably somewhere in his early 50s, with watery, bloodshot eyes, beard-stubbled cheeks, and unruly grey eyebrows that met over the bridge of a ponderous nose. A stale, musty odour rose from his old-fashioned frock coat and yellow, ruffled-fronted shirt, as if he'd borrowed his clothes from one of the cases in his exhibit. "A personal tour, please," said Sebastian, duly handing over his sixpence. Thistlewood swept a courtly bow. "Right this way, your lordship." He ushered Sebastian into a chamber jammed with dusty, glass-topped cases and walls crowded close with everything from curious pieces of driftwood and giant turtle shells to primitive spears and antique swords. Items too large for the cases or walls, a stuffed alligator, giant elephant's tusks, even a canoe fashioned from a hollowed-out log, hung from the ceiling. Pausing in the centre of the room, Thistlewood sucked in a deep breath and launched into what was obviously a well-rehearsed spiel, delivered in a sing-song voice. "In this case here you'll see a Roman bishop's crozier, antique coins found when they were laying down new water pipes in Bath, and a set of prayer beads made from the bones of St. Anthony of Padua." "Really?" said Sebastian, peering at the rosary. The beads certainly appeared to have been made from someone's bones. Thistlewood squared his shoulders and looked affronted. "Surely you are not questioning their authenticity?" "No, of course not." They moved on to the next case. "The most notable items here are a piece of sandstone bearing the fossilized imprint of ancient ferns and a giant frog found on the Isle of Dogs." Sebastian studied the stuffed amphibian, which looked to be a good 14 inches long. "Somehow I suspect he was not native to fair England." "No," agreed Thistlewood. "Most likely a stowaway hopped off one of the ships docked there, I always thought." He raised a hand toward the wall above the case. "The sword you see hanging here was used in the coronation of King Charles himself, and—" "First or second?" asked Sebastian, his interest caught. "First." Thistlewood nodded to the next case. "And here we have Queen Elizabeth's prayer book and strawberry dish." "Where did you get all these—" Sebastian paused, searching for an appropriate word, and finally settled on "objects." "The original collection was begun by my grandfather, the first Basil Thistlewood. He was valet to none other than Sir Hans Sloane himself, before Sir Hans bequeathed most of his collection to the nation. When my grandfather left his service in 1725 to open a coffee-house on these premises, Sir Hans most graciously gave him a number of items to put on display. My grandfather himself increased the collection considerably, as did my father after him, and I have continued the tradition. Fortunately, we are quite popular with sea captains, who every year bring us a variety of new, interesting specimens from their worldwide voyages." Sebastian leaned over a nearby case to study the array of stone projectile points displayed there. "I've heard you were recently frustrated in your attempts to acquire the Duke of Suffolk's head." Thistlewood worked his jaw back and forth, as if so overcome with fury as to find it difficult to spit out his words. "It should have been mine. I'm the one who heard about it first and identified it." "Oh?" "I've long suspected Suffolk was buried at Holy Trinity. So when the sexton told me they'd found a small box containing a head while in the process of settling the crypt in order, it took only one look for me to know right away whose it was." "You recognized him?" "Instantly. The resemblance to his portraits is striking." "I'd always heard Suffolk was beheaded with one clean stroke. A tale, I'm afraid, put about to quiet the murmurs of the populace." He nodded to a long-handled sword hanging near the doorway to the next room. "See that? It's an executioner's sword. They were typically between 3 and 4 feet long and about 2 inches wide. The handle was made like that so the executioner could grip it in both fists to get a good leverage." Sebastian studied the plain, heavy blade. According to family tradition, 2 of his mother's ancestors had lost their heads on Tower Hill, but until now Sebastian had never given much thought to the particulars of their execution. There were 2 different types of blocks used, you know, said Thistlewood, warming to what was obviously a favourite topic. With a high block like this one here. He paused to put his hand on a worn chunk of wood several feet high, with a large polished scoop on one side, and a slight indentation on the other. The prisoners would kneel and bend forward so that their heads rested over the top of the block. But with the low block, the poor condemned souls had to lie down flat, with their necks on this little thing here. He pointed to a long, narrow length of wood resting atop a nearby case. That put their heads at all the wrong angle for the job, I'm afraid. Sebastian tried to ignore an unpleasant tickling sensation along the base of his skull. Of course, Thistlewood was saying, the block was only used when the executioner employed an axe rather than the sword. Here, in England, we tended to favour the style of axe you see here. He pointed to a massive specimen hanging precariously from the ceiling. It's basically modelled after a woodsman's axe. Looks nasty, said Sebastian, squinting up at it. It is indeed. The handle is a full 5 feet long, while the blade is 10 inches. In Germany they use something quite different, essentially a giant butcher's cleaver, except with a longer handle. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those, so I can't show it to you. That's quite all right, said Sebastian. How many blows did it take to cut off the head of Charles I? Just one. All the reports agree on that. Whoever did it obviously knew his craft, which wasn't usually the case, I'm afraid. The executioner who did for Anne Boleyn used a sword and did it in one stroke too, but then he was brought over from France, special, at her request, because he was so good. The thing is, beheadings weren't all that common, and they were typically done by the hangman, who botched the job more often than not. Took 3 blows to get the head off Mary, Queen of Scots, and the idiot who did for the Countess of Salisbury struck the poor old woman 11 times before he got the job done. Sebastian found his gaze drawn again to the executioner's sword. So how did Preston end up with Suffolk's head, if you're the one who first identified it? Pure greed on the part of the sexton, I'm afraid. Once he knew what he had, he went trotting off to Preston and offered to sell it to him. It must have been infuriating to discover that Preston had managed to buy Suffolk's head away from you. Wasn't it just? Agreed Thistlewood. Why, He broke off, eyes widening, as he suddenly became aware of the dangerous trap yawning before him. Clearing his throat, he turned away to rub the sleeve of his coat across the top of the nearest case, as if wiping at a smudge. But then, happens all the time. I'm used to it. You didn't quarrel with Preston because of it? Well, we may have had words when we met by chance in Sloane Square one day, but nothing serious. No. I'm a humble man. Can't expect to compete with those blessed with deep pockets. What is the going price for a head? Depends on who the head originally belonged to, I suppose. But I couldn't really say. Virtually everything here was given to me, or my father or grandfather, to be put on display for all to see. I take it Preston bought many of the objects he collected? He did, yes. But then he could afford to, couldn't he? And you're saying the sexton who found Suffolk's head took it to Preston? Thistlewood's enormous nose quivered with a renewed rush of indignation. The very day I identified it. Did he actually take the head to Alford House and offer it to Preston himself? I suppose. I mean, he must have, right? Rather than answer, Sebastian let his gaze wander again around that extraordinary collection. Who would one contact if he were interested in trafficking in rare objects of an historical nature? Well, there's Christie's, of course. What if one were interested in something a little more illicit? Thistlewood gave a quick look around, as if to make certain no one was listening, then leaned in close to whisper. "There's a shop in Houndsditch, kept by an Irishwoman named of Pris Mulligan. She carries all sorts of things. Some of her stock comes from emigres and others down on their luck, but not all, or so I'm told. Provides a market for stolen goods, does she?"
Thistlewood nodded solemnly. "Worked with smugglers, bringing items in from the continent, too.
Only you didn't hear that from me, if you get my drift. She's not someone you want to get riled at you. Folks who cross Pris Mulligan have a nasty habit of disappearing, or turning up dead in horrible ways." He closed his eyes and gave a little shudder. "Horrible ways. Do you think Stanley Preston could have run afoul of her?" "Could have. Hadn't thought about it, but there's no denying he definitely could have. Heard he bought a Spanish reliquary from her a month or so ago. Some saint's foot, although I can't recall precisely whose at the moment. Thing is, Preston had a temper, hot enough to override his sense when he was in a passion. And anyone who deals with Pris Mulligan had best keep their wits about them at all times."
Thistlewood paused, his tongue flicking out to lick his dry lips.
You won't be telling her where you heard any of this, will you?"
"I can be very discreet," said Sebastian. "Tell me this. What do you think Preston was doing at Bloody Bridge that night?"
Thistlewood's eyes went wide. "Don't know. Does seem a queer place for him to be, don't it? Any chance he might have been taking possession of some new object for his collection? That Bloody Bridge? In the middle of the night? Whatever for? Perhaps the object or objects were illicitly acquired by the seller. But why Bloody Bridge?"
Sebastian had no answer for that. He studied the curiosity collector's slack, seemingly innocent face.
"Where were you Sunday night?"
"Me?" Thistlewood's gaze faltered beneath Sebastian's scrutiny and drifted away.
"Same place I am every night. Here. Never left. Not for one moment, from noon till past midnight."
He cleared his throat.
"Now, shall we move on to the next room?"
"Please."
Sebastian continued to listen with only half his attention, while Thistlewood droned on about Roman pictures and Pacific dart guns. He figured it was at most a mile, probably less, from the coffee-house to Bloody Bridge. It would have been easy enough for Thistlewood to walk there, whack off Preston's head with one of the many swords in his collection, and hurry back, all within half an hour. It was certainly a possibility, from the sound of things. Thistlewood was angry enough about Preston's purchase of Suffolk's head to have decided to exact such a ghoulish revenge. Except, how would Thistlewood have known to seek his victim that night at Bloody Bridge?